In the quiet sprawl of an ordinary American suburb, where cul-de-sacs curved like sheltered arms and children's bicycles lay scattered on neat lawns, life carried a polished stillness that suggested safety. From the outside, everything appeared stable. Families woke early, fathers drove to work, mothers tended to household routines, and neighbors exchanged polite smiles as they trimmed their hedges. It was the sort of place where scandal seemed impossible. But as countless cases in true crime history reveal, behind the walls of ordinary homes, extraordinary darkness often brews. The woman at the center of this story was 41-year-old Marissa Callahan. To her neighbors, she was an attentive housewife, committed to her family, present at every school fundraiser, and always ready with a warm casserole for community gatherings. She lived in a modest but well-kept home with her husband, Daniel, and their teenage daughter, Emily. For years, they had seemed like the portrait of suburban normality. But beneath the veneer of stability, Marissa's life was unraveling in ways no one around her could see. Daniel worked long hours as an accountant, leaving her to spend most days isolated in the quiet of their home. Her daughter, absorbed in the turbulence of adolescence, had begun to drift from her mother, leaving Marissa with long, empty hours to fill. She felt invisible, unappreciated, and restless. What no one could have predicted was that her growing dissatisfaction would eventually lead her to choices that ended in violence and tragedy. Next door lived the Millers, a family whose son Ryan had just turned 20. Ryan was the opposite of what Marissa's life represented. He was young, athletic, reckless, and full of the sort of intensity Marissa hadn't felt in years. He was the kind of presence that pulled attention effortlessly, and Marissa, starved for recognition, found herself drawn toward him in ways she could neither explain nor control. The affair that would one day shock the entire neighborhood began quietly, almost invisibly, like a spark buried deep in dry grass. At first, it was glances exchanged across the driveway, then casual conversations as Ryan helped her carry groceries or mow her lawn when Daniel was away. What started as small interactions soon grew into a secret routine. Marissa, once cautious, began to crave the thrill of his attention. And Ryan, still barely more than a boy, was flattered by the affection of an older woman who seemed worldly compared to the girls his own age. The secrecy only deepened their connection. Their clandestine encounters, fueled by desire and recklessness, began to overshadow Marissa's life. She became distant at home, distracted during family dinners, and absent-minded in her duties. Yet no one noticed at first. Suburbs have a way of blinding people, encouraging them to accept the illusion of stability without looking too closely. But secrecy, as it so often does in true crime narratives, bred danger. What neither Marissa nor Ryan realized was how quickly their actions would spiral into obsession, betrayal, and ultimately murder. The choices they were making were not happening in a vacuum. Others would soon notice changes, suspicions would grow, and in the end someone would pay the ultimate price. By the summer of 2018, the affair had escalated beyond stolen moments. Marissa was no longer satisfied with brief encounters. The intoxicating feeling of being wanted had begun to consume her, and Ryan, too young to understand the weight of such entanglement, found himself overwhelmed. He wanted the excitement, but he didn't want the responsibility. And that imbalance would prove catastrophic. It is important to understand that in so many of the world's most shocking cases, the seeds of tragedy are sown long before the crime itself. Marissa's loneliness, Daniel's absence, Ryan's immaturity, and the quiet rhythms of suburban life all converged to create the perfect storm. What began as a secret escape would soon ignite into something that could not be hidden. And when it finally came to light, the suburb that once seemed so safe would become the setting of a nightmare. The first cracks in the illusion appeared when neighbors began noticing Ryan's car parked in Marissa's driveway during Daniel's late shifts. At first, people dismissed it. After all, suburban communities thrive on polite denial. But whispers began, quiet conversations exchanged in backyards and over fences. And soon, Daniel himself would begin to sense that something was terribly wrong. As we move deeper into this story, what unfolds is not merely an affair gone wrong, but a descent into obsession, manipulation, and deadly consequence. The lines between love, lust, and control blur until the outcome becomes inevitable. A murder that shocks everyone, yet in hindsight seems tragically predictable. By the time authorities would one day arrive at the Callahan home, Summoned by frantic neighbors and horrified witnesses, the truth would already be written in blood. But in this beginning, in this quiet suburb, everything still looked normal. The lawns were still green, the houses still tidy, and the people still smiling. No one yet realized they were living beside a story that would one day make national headlines. And as the summer heat settled over the neighborhood, Marissa's choices were already steering her toward an ending far darker than anyone could have imagined. Affairs rarely begin with explosions. They start quietly, like a shadow creeping unnoticed across a wall. For Marissa Callahan, what began as brief encounters with Ryan Miller soon morphed into a dangerous fixation that consumed her thoughts. She had convinced herself that their secret relationship was harmless, something she could control, something that would not disrupt the fragile balance of her life. But secrecy thrives on adrenaline, and adrenaline soon demands escalation. Marissa's mornings, once defined by routine, making breakfast, cleaning the kitchen, folding laundry, shifted into carefully orchestrated opportunities to see Ryan. She timed her errands for when she knew his parents would be gone. She lingered outside in her garden, waiting for the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. The smallest interaction sent jolts through her that felt addictive, feeding an emptiness she had carried for years. With Daniel working long hours and her daughter retreating further into teenage independence, Ryan filled a void she could no longer ignore. At first, Ryan treated their connection like a game. He was flattered by the attention, amused by the secrecy, and thrilled by the risk. But unlike Marissa, he was not seeking permanence. His world revolved around parties, college classes, and friends his own age. For him, the affair was an indulgence, something he could brag about in half-hidden terms to close companions, though never naming her. He thrived on the power of knowing he had been chosen by a woman older, experienced, and forbidden. But imbalance lurked in their dynamic. Marissa's need grew stronger with each passing week. She began investing emotionally in ways Ryan could not reciprocate. She told herself he understood her in ways Daniel never had. She imagined futures where the two of them could exist without secrecy, without the constraints of suburban expectations. In her mind, she was not simply having an affair. She was rediscovering her life. This widening gulf between perception and reality is often the spark that drives true crime stories toward tragedy. For Marissa, the affair became the center of her existence. For Ryan, it was a fleeting thrill. And when one person begins to lean too heavily on the other, cracks inevitably form. The first signs of tension appeared as summer deepened. Ryan began pulling away. He answered texts less frequently, skipped planned meetings, and made excuses about friends, classes, or family obligations. Marissa, desperate to hold on to him, pressed harder. She offered gifts, cooked meals, and created elaborate justifications for why he should spend time with her. She began to watch for him obsessively, waiting at windows for the glimpse of his car, the sound of his footsteps. Soon, what had begun as passion turned into a dangerous imbalance of power. Ryan felt suffocated. Marissa felt abandoned. And the more he tried to retreat, the more she fought to keep him close. This spiral of need and rejection set in motion the unraveling of control that would ultimately explode in violence. In neighborhoods like theirs, appearances remained paramount. Outwardly, nothing seemed amiss. Marissa still attended community events, Daniel still worked late, Emily still lived in her adolescent bubble, and the Millers continued their routines. But beneath that surface, Marissa was unraveling. She began lying more frequently, telling Daniel she was running errands when she was in fact meeting Ryan, or claiming she was helping a friend when she was really lingering near his college campus. Lies layered upon lies, each one tightening the noose around her life. What she didn't realize was that secrets in suburban communities rarely stay hidden for long. Neighbors noticed Ryan's car parked in her driveway when Daniel was gone. Some whispered about how often the two were seen together in seemingly innocent circumstances. Others dismissed it, not wanting to believe such scandal could touch their quiet street. But suspicion had already taken root, and suspicion spreads quickly. For Daniel, the first flicker of doubt came in small ways. Marissa's distractedness, her growing disinterest in family dinners, her frequent absences. At first, he attributed it to midlife restlessness, perhaps even depression. But the unease lingered, gnawing at him. He began to watch more closely, though he never spoke his thoughts aloud. The imbalance between Marissa and Ryan continued to deepen. The more he resisted, the more insistent she became. She began to pressure him to make choices he was unwilling to make. She hinted at leaving Daniel, at building a life together, at embracing the relationship openly. For Ryan, who never intended anything serious, the idea was suffocating. He began to pull back more sharply, avoiding her calls, dodging her attempts to corner him. But obsession does not fade quietly. Rejection fueled Marissa's desperation, and desperation pushed her into dangerous territory. She began tracking his movements, questioning his excuses, even appearing at places she knew he would be without warning. For Ryan, the thrill of the affair turned to dread. For Marissa, every sign of his withdrawal felt like betrayal. By the end of that summer, the relationship had shifted from secrecy and passion to obsession and resentment. The power dynamics had reversed. Ryan wanted out, but Marissa would not let go. This is where so many true crime narratives pivot, where the thrill of secrecy transforms into the volatility of desperation. The emotional stakes grew unbearable. Marissa, once careful, began to take reckless risks. She stayed out longer, fabricated elaborate lies, and ignored the rising suspicion around her. Ryan, trapped between fear of exposure and fear of Marissa's wrath, began to contemplate drastic measures to escape. What neither of them realized was that the spiral they had entered rarely ends without devastation. Affairs may begin quietly, but when desperation collides with rejection, the fallout is explosive. The seeds of murder were already sown. The only question was when they would take root. The suburban neighborhood, still blissfully unaware, moved into autumn. Leaves fell, lawns turned brown, and families prepared for the school year ahead. But behind the Callahans' front door, and in the hidden corners of the Millers' household, a storm was gathering. A storm that would not stay hidden for much longer. The affair that had once felt intoxicating was now an anchor dragging them both down. And soon, the quiet suburb would find itself at the center of a story that would make headlines across the country. A story where desire, betrayal, and violence collided in the most horrifying way imaginable. Affairs that thrive on secrecy often begin to rot under the weight of exposure. For months, Marissa Callahan had lived on the thrill of stolen moments, the intoxication of forbidden attention, and the fantasy of a second life. But as autumn arrived, the cracks in her carefully constructed illusion began to widen. She could no longer balance the facade of her suburban family life with the demands of her obsession, and those around her were beginning to notice. The first signs came in the form of subtle shifts that seemed innocuous on the surface. Marissa grew increasingly distracted, forgetting small but important details. Bills went unpaid, her daughter's school events slipped her mind, and her once carefully maintained home began to show signs of neglect. Neighbors who once admired her as a model homemaker whispered about how tired she looked, how withdrawn she had become, how something in her demeanor seemed off. For Daniel, the unease that had begun as a faint suspicion hardened into something more troubling. He noticed her absences, her evasive explanations, and the way she seemed to retreat inward even when she was physically present. He had no proof of wrongdoing, but the atmosphere of their marriage had shifted in a way that could not be ignored. Dinner conversations were reduced to silence, and the warmth that had once defined their family life grew cold. He began watching more closely, though he lacked the courage to confront her directly. Emily, their teenage daughter, sensed it as well. Children are often the first to detect fractures in the household. She noticed her mother's growing irritability, her distracted responses, her frequent glances at her phone. Though Emily did not know the truth, she knew something was wrong, and the unspoken tension between her parents created an unease that settled over the home like a shadow. Outside the Callahan household, whispers grew louder. Ryan's car was still spotted at odd times, parked in places that raised questions. Neighbors who had once chosen polite denial began to wonder if the rumors had merit. Suburbs thrive on image, but they also thrive on gossip, and soon the story of Marissa and Ryan began to circulate in hushed tones. What began as speculation became, in many minds, an unspoken certainty. Ryan himself was unraveling under the strain. For him, the affair had lost its thrill long ago. What had once been an exhilarating secret had become a suffocating burden. He felt trapped between the fear of exposure and the relentless demands of Marissa's attention. Each interaction with her grew more fraught, her intensity more alarming. He began to withdraw completely, refusing calls, making excuses, and avoiding her at every opportunity. But withdrawal only heightened Marissa's desperation. She clung to the fantasy that Ryan was her escape from the monotony of her life, the answer to the emptiness that had consumed her marriage. The more he pulled away, the more she pushed forward, convinced that his reluctance was temporary, that if she only fought harder, he would return to her. The imbalance between them had now reached a breaking point, where obsession and rejection collided in dangerous ways. Marissa's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would leave the house at odd hours, inventing excuses that grew less believable with each passing week. She lingered outside Ryan's home, appearing in places he frequented, weaving herself into his world in ways that unsettled him deeply. Her fixation had crossed the boundary between secrecy and obsession, and her inability to let go created a tension that neither of them could escape. The psychological toll of this imbalance began to manifest in ways that were visible to others. Marissa grew thinner, her appearance less polished, her once confident presence replaced by an air of quiet desperation. Ryan's friends noticed his unease, his constant checking over his shoulder, his reluctance to speak openly about his life. Those closest to them sensed that something was spiraling out of control, though the full extent of the danger remained hidden. What makes stories like these so chilling is the inevitability of what follows. With each day that passed, the fragile illusion of normalcy disintegrated further. The marriage that once anchored Marissa was collapsing under the weight of betrayal. The youthful recklessness that once drew Ryan into the affair had transformed into fear. And the suburban community that once felt safe was now buzzing with the undercurrent of scandal. By late autumn, the situation had reached a tipping point. Daniel, no longer content to silently endure his suspicions, began quietly investigating. He checked receipts, monitored her movements, and noted inconsistencies in her explanations. He was not yet ready to confront her, but he was gathering evidence in his own quiet way. Each discovery fueled his growing conviction that his wife was hiding something dark. At the same time, Ryan was contemplating escape. He wanted out of the affair, out of the suffocating grip of Marissa's obsession, and out of the web of lies that had ensnared him. But he was also terrified of what she might do if he ended it completely. She had hinted at leaving her husband, hinted at destroying her family for him, and he feared the consequences of rejecting her outright. He was caught in a trap of his own making, one that now threatened to ruin not only his life but hers as well. Marissa, meanwhile, was unraveling faster than anyone realized. Her obsession with Ryan consumed her thoughts to the exclusion of everything else. She lived in a world of fantasy, convincing herself that their relationship was destined, that his resistance was only temporary, that soon he would embrace the life she envisioned. But beneath this fantasy was a growing undercurrent of anger. Anger at Ryan for pulling away, anger at Daniel for not seeing her, anger at a life that had left her feeling invisible. That anger, once buried, was beginning to surface in dangerous ways. In so many true crime stories, this is the moment when the trajectory becomes irreversible. The cracks were no longer hidden. They were visible to anyone who looked closely enough. The marriage was strained to its breaking point. The affair was collapsing under the weight of obsession and fear. The community was whispering, suspicion was spreading, and the individuals at the center were trapped in a spiral of secrecy and desperation. What none of them realized was that the story was already shifting from scandal to tragedy. The seeds of violence had been planted. All it would take was one final spark to ignite the devastation that had been building for months. As the year drew closer to winter, the atmosphere in the Callahan household grew colder, darker, more oppressive. The illusion of normalcy had all but vanished. Everyone involved was living under the weight of secrets that could not be contained. And soon, those secrets would explode into a crime that would shock the entire community. By the arrival of winter, the fragile balance of secrecy and denial had been shattered beyond repair. What had once been a reckless affair conducted in the shadows had now evolved into a toxic entanglement, marked by desperation, fear, and simmering anger. The participants were trapped in a cycle that could no longer sustain itself. The breaking point was no longer a distant threat. It was an inevitability pressing closer with every passing day. For Marissa Callahan, the affair had ceased to be a distraction or an escape. It had become her reality. She no longer viewed her connection with Ryan Miller as a secret indulgence but as a lifeline, something that defined her very sense of worth. She saw herself not as a woman engaged in betrayal, but as someone who had finally found passion, finally found validation after years of feeling invisible. This distorted sense of reality made her cling to Ryan with a ferocity that alarmed him. What she considered love had hardened into possession. Her husband Daniel's quiet suspicions had now become silent conviction. The patterns of absence, the unexplained phone calls, the subtle lies, all painted a picture he could no longer ignore. Yet Daniel remained paralyzed between confrontation and denial. He had invested years into his marriage and family, and the possibility of betrayal was too destabilizing to face directly. Instead, he watched, waited, and quietly documented, gathering proof as if preparing for a reckoning that he did not yet know how to initiate. Emily, their teenage daughter, felt the tension as a constant presence. The home she once considered safe had become stifling, the silence between her parents unbearable. Though she did not know the full truth, she carried the weight of suspicion, sensing that her family was on the verge of collapse. The emotional void in the household left her isolated, forced to navigate adolescence against the backdrop of unspoken turmoil. Ryan, the neighbor's son whose youth and recklessness had drawn him into this spiral, was now desperate to escape. What had begun as excitement had transformed into suffocation. He was overwhelmed by the weight of Marissa's obsession and terrified of the consequences of breaking free. Each attempt to withdraw was met with her escalating desperation, her pleas, her anger, her insistence that he could not abandon her. He felt trapped in a situation that had spiraled far beyond his control. The imbalance between them had reached critical mass. Marissa viewed Ryan as her future. Ryan viewed her as a threat. This disparity created a toxic tension that could not be sustained. In true crime stories, it is often at this stage, when love transforms into obsession and fear transforms into anger, that violence becomes not just possible, but inevitable. Marissa's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She began to follow Ryan more openly, appearing in places she knew he would be, intruding into his world with alarming persistence. She convinced herself that his rejection was temporary, that his reluctance was proof of immaturity rather than a genuine desire to be free. Her inability to accept reality deepened her fixation, creating an emotional storm that clouded her judgment. Her anger, once buried beneath layers of secrecy, began to surface. She resented Daniel for his indifference, resented Emily for her growing independence, and resented Ryan for pulling away. She felt trapped between the roles she had been assigned: wife, mother, neighbor, and the fantasy she had constructed with Ryan. The more those two realities collided, the more volatile she became. Ryan, sensing her instability, withdrew further. He limited contact, avoided her messages, and distanced himself physically and emotionally. But this only intensified Marissa's panic. She began to lash out, alternating between desperate attempts to pull him back and simmering fury at his rejection. In her mind, she had sacrificed everything for him: her marriage, her reputation, her stability, and his abandonment felt like betrayal of the deepest kind. The community, once only whispering, now watched more openly. Neighbors noted her presence at Ryan's house, her odd absences, her distracted demeanor. Rumors solidified into near certainty. The scandal that had once been speculation was now accepted as truth among those who lived nearby. The illusion of privacy was gone, and the pressure of exposure weighed heavily on everyone involved. Inside the Callahan home, the atmosphere grew colder, more oppressive. Daniel's silence became a weapon, his distance a constant reminder that he knew more than he revealed. Emily's unease turned to resentment, her relationship with her mother strained by the tension she could not name but could not escape. Marissa herself oscillated between panic and fury, torn between clinging to her fantasy and lashing out at those who threatened it. By midwinter, the affair was no longer sustainable. Ryan had all but severed contact, Daniel was preparing for confrontation, and Marissa was unraveling under the combined weight of obsession, secrecy, and fear of exposure. The breaking point had arrived. The psychology of cases like this often follows a familiar pattern. When obsession collides with rejection, and when fantasy collides with reality, the outcome is rarely peaceful. Marissa was no longer in control of her emotions. Her anger grew sharper, her thoughts darker, her sense of desperation more profound. She could not bear the thought of losing Ryan, but she also could not face the collapse of her marriage, her family, and her reputation. In her unraveling mind, the solution began to take shape. Not reconciliation, not acceptance, but destruction. Ryan, for his part, underestimated the danger. He saw Marissa as unstable, but he did not believe she was capable of violence. Like many young men caught in affairs with older partners, he assumed he could eventually distance himself without consequence. He believed that time and avoidance would resolve the problem. What he did not understand was that Marissa was already crossing the threshold into a mindset where rejection was intolerable, where betrayal demanded a response, where fantasy could only be preserved through desperate means. Daniel, unaware of the full extent of the danger, believed the breaking point would be a confrontation, perhaps a separation, perhaps a divorce. He did not anticipate violence. His focus was on protecting his daughter and his dignity, preparing for the collapse of his marriage, but he underestimated the storm building around him. As winter deepened, the neighborhood remained unaware of how close it was to becoming the backdrop of tragedy. To outsiders, the Callahans still appeared as another family weathering private struggles. To insiders, the air was thick with tension, silence, and unspoken dread. And at the center of it all was Marissa, a woman torn between two worlds, consumed by obsession, and standing on the edge of an irreversible choice. The breaking point had arrived. The only question now was how it would manifest, and who would pay the ultimate price when it did. When secrecy collapses, what remains is raw desperation. Marissa Callahan had passed the point of no return. The thrill that once defined her affair with Ryan Miller had eroded, leaving behind something far more dangerous. What began as a secret indulgence had hardened into obsession, an all-consuming fixation that governed her every thought and action. She could not let go, even as Ryan tried to distance himself, even as her family unraveled, even as her community whispered. For Marissa, letting go meant losing her identity. Obsession is rarely born overnight. It grows slowly, nurtured by isolation, fantasy, and fear. Marissa's life had been marked by years of neglect, years of feeling unseen in her marriage, years of monotony in the routines of suburban domesticity. Ryan's attention had awakened something she thought was long dead, and once awakened, she could not return to the emptiness that had come before. Every moment without him felt unbearable. Every rejection cut her deeper. In her distorted perspective, Ryan was no longer simply a lover. He was salvation. Ryan, however, had moved on emotionally. His attempts to sever ties had been clumsy, inconsistent, and half-hearted, but they were clear enough to signal his growing detachment. He no longer answered calls promptly, no longer lingered in her presence, no longer sought her out. For him, the affair was a mistake, something to be left behind, buried in silence. Yet his avoidance only fed Marissa's obsession. She mistook his distance for hesitation rather than finality. In her mind, she believed she could win him back if only she tried harder, if only she fought harder, if only she proved that she was the one who truly understood him. Her fixation consumed her daily life. She checked his social media obsessively, dissecting every post, every photo, every comment, searching for clues about his thoughts and feelings. She drove past places he frequented, inventing excuses to appear where she knew he might be. She lingered in shadows of his world, desperate for proximity, desperate to remind him she was still there. The more he pulled away, the more she tightened her grip, suffocating him in ways he could not escape. At home, her dissent was evident. Her relationship with Daniel had deteriorated into icy silence. The bond with her daughter, once fragile, now fractured completely. Household responsibilities went neglected, meals forgotten, bills unpaid. Her life no longer revolved around family but around Ryan, and the absence of stability fed the chaos in her mind. Those who encountered her noticed the change, her gaunt appearance, her distracted demeanor, the wild edge in her eyes. Yet in the privacy of her home, the depths of her obsession were far more alarming than anyone realized. Daniel, now convinced of her betrayal, contemplated his next move. He had gathered enough circumstantial evidence to confirm his suspicions, though he lacked the final proof. His focus shifted from denial to preparation. He began quietly considering separation, contemplating how to protect his daughter from the fallout. But his silence, intended as self-preservation, only fueled Marissa's paranoia. She interpreted his distance as knowledge, his restraint as judgment, his silence as condemnation. She felt cornered, trapped between a failing marriage and a crumbling affair. Ryan's fear grew sharper with each passing week. He felt pursued, hounded, unable to break free from Marissa's relentless presence. Friends noticed his unease, his constant vigilance, his reluctance to share details of his life. He worried about exposure, worried about the consequences of revelation, but above all, he worried about what Marissa might do if pushed too far. He sensed her instability, but like so many before him, he underestimated the depths of her obsession. What distinguishes obsession from passion is the absence of choice. Marissa no longer saw Ryan as someone with agency. She saw him as hers. In her mind, his withdrawal was betrayal, his independence a threat, his rejection intolerable. She convinced herself that he needed her, that he loved her, that he would eventually return to her if only she removed the obstacles in their path. This distorted belief system set the stage for the unthinkable. Her thoughts grew darker, her fantasies more violent. Anger replaced longing, resentment replaced affection. She began to imagine scenarios in which betrayal was punished, in which rejection carried consequences, in which control could only be maintained through destruction. The human mind, once consumed by obsession, is capable of rationalizing even the most horrifying acts. For Marissa, the idea of losing Ryan entirely was unbearable. If she could not have him, no one could. The warning signs were there, as they often are in cases like these. Erratic behavior, sudden outbursts, moments of unsettling calm followed by storms of rage. But those around her either failed to recognize them or chose to ignore them. Daniel, consumed by his own plans for separation, focused inward. Emily, retreating into her own world, distanced herself further. Neighbors, though whispering, avoided involvement. And Ryan, though fearful, believed avoidance would protect him. Each of them underestimated the depth of Marissa's descent, and each would pay for that miscalculation. By the start of the new year, Marissa had reached a point of no return. Her obsession had become her identity, her anger her fuel, her fantasies her only escape. She oscillated between desperate attempts to draw Ryan back and simmering rage at his absence. Her behavior was no longer calculated. It was impulsive, reckless, and dangerous. Every rejection drove her closer to the edge. Every silence screamed betrayal. Every glance at Ryan's world without her ignited a fury she could not contain. The descent into obsession is often silent, invisible to outsiders until it erupts into violence. Marissa's unraveling was hidden behind suburban walls, cloaked in the illusion of privacy, buried beneath the denial of those around her. But within her the storm was raging, growing stronger, preparing for release. Ryan believed distance would save him. Daniel believed silence would protect him. Emily believed avoidance would shield her. The neighbors believed gossip was harmless. But none of them realized that the descent had already passed the point of control. Marissa was no longer simply a housewife in crisis. She was a woman consumed by obsession, transformed by desperation, and poised to cross the line from betrayal to bloodshed. The descent was complete. The next step was inevitable. Obsession has a rhythm, and with Marissa Callahan, that rhythm had shifted from longing to volatility. By the early spring, her days had collapsed into a cycle of fixation, rage, and despair. What once resembled a clandestine romance had now mutated into a dangerous spiral. Her mind, no longer governed by reason, sought only one outcome: absolute control. Every thought bent toward reclaiming Ryan Miller, and every rejection felt like an existential wound. She could not separate herself from the fantasy she had built, and when reality threatened it, she lashed out. The transformation was subtle to outsiders but unmistakable to anyone who had once known her well. Her appearance reflected the turmoil inside. Her once polished image had faded into disarray. Her clothes hung loose, her hair often unkempt, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. Yet beneath the exhaustion simmered a manic energy. She wrote pages of fragmented thoughts, scribbled letters she never sent, crafted elaborate justifications for actions she had not yet taken. Her obsession had become a full-time occupation, eclipsing family, responsibilities, and reputation. Ryan remained her central fixation. His withdrawal, once seen as temporary, had now hardened into avoidance. He did not answer her calls. He ignored her messages. He adjusted his routines to evade her. For most, such rejection would have signaled finality, but for Marissa, it only deepened her conviction. She twisted his silence into proof that he still cared but was too afraid to show it. Each step he took away from her became, in her mind, a secret signal that he was testing her loyalty. This delusion reinforced her obsession, convincing her that persistence was not madness but devotion. Her family felt the consequences of her unraveling. Daniel lived in a state of quiet detachment, focusing on exit strategies and preparing for the collapse he knew was coming. He had stopped trying to repair the marriage. Instead, he focused on shielding his daughter from the growing storm. Emily, sensing the instability, withdrew further into her own world, avoiding her mother whenever possible. The household had become a fractured space where silence carried more weight than words, and avoidance became the only form of peace. But Marissa's obsession could not be contained within four walls. It spilled into her community, seeping into places where her presence was unwanted and unsettling. Neighbors saw her wandering late at night, circling streets with no destination. Co-workers whispered about her erratic behavior, her bursts of energy followed by days of withdrawal. Those closest to Ryan noticed her shadow in unexpected places, near his workplace, outside gatherings, even trailing his car at a distance. The line between private fixation and public disturbance had already been crossed. As her obsession escalated, so did her fantasies of control. Her private writings revealed a woman at war with herself. One page declared her undying love, promising eternal devotion if only Ryan would return. The next dripped with anger, filled with violent imagery directed at anyone she perceived as standing in her way. Her mind shifted rapidly between pleading and punishment, affection and rage. This instability made her unpredictable, and unpredictability is what made her dangerous. Daniel noticed her volatility but underestimated its scope. He believed her obsession was destructive but confined to her emotional world. He did not imagine that her fixation on Ryan could manifest into violence. He planned legal separation, financial disentanglement, and custody arrangements, but he never planned for what might happen if Marissa acted on her impulses. Like many who witness obsession, he saw the cracks but not the fault line beneath them. Ryan, meanwhile, attempted to build walls of distance. He leaned on friends, structured his routines for safety, and limited his exposure. Yet fear gnawed at him. He recognized the intensity of Marissa's fixation, the way she appeared uninvited, the persistence of her calls. He began to wonder if silence would be enough. He considered stronger measures, restraining orders, official complaints, but hesitated. Fear of exposure, fear of humiliation, fear of professional fallout restrained him. By choosing silence over confrontation, he inadvertently gave her obsession room to grow unchecked. The turning point came quietly, not in a single explosive event, but in the slow accumulation of small fractures. The rejections piled higher. The silence stretched longer. The distance grew wider. For Marissa, each slight was unbearable. Each unreturned message was a wound. Each ignored presence was an act of cruelty. In her mind, the narrative shifted. She was no longer a woman fighting for love but a victim of betrayal, abandoned by the man she had sacrificed everything for. Betrayal demanded response. The psychology of obsession often demands escalation. When fantasy no longer sustains itself, action becomes inevitable. Marissa's thoughts drifted further into dangerous territory. The idea of reclaiming Ryan through devotion gave way to the idea of punishing him for his abandonment. She began to believe that she alone had the right to determine the outcome of their relationship. If Ryan would not return willingly, she would ensure he could not escape her grasp. Signs of impending crisis were visible in her behavior. She isolated herself almost completely, stopped answering calls from family, and neglected basic routines. She grew increasingly erratic in public, at times calm and controlled, at other times confrontational and hostile. She was seen watching Ryan's house for hours, her car parked just out of sight. She began carrying notebooks filled with obsessive writings, some of which included veiled threats. Each of these signs, if taken together, pointed clearly to an impending breaking point. Yet no one assembled the pieces in time. The breaking point arrived with inevitability. For Marissa, the internal pressure had reached its maximum. The obsession that once fed her had now consumed her, leaving only one path forward: confrontation. The fantasies of devotion had dissolved. Only rage remained. Rage at Ryan for abandoning her. Rage at Daniel for exposing her. Rage at Emily for retreating from her. Rage at a world that refused to validate her reality. That rage demanded release, and the target was clear. Obsession does not dissipate quietly. It combusts. When the breaking point came, it did not look like passion or heartbreak. It looked like destruction. It looked like a woman consumed not by love but by fury, no longer capable of separating fantasy from truth. For Marissa Callahan, the descent was complete, and the line between obsession and violence had been crossed. The breaking point was not just the end of an affair. It was the birth of tragedy. Violence rarely erupts without warning. It simmers beneath the surface, fueled by resentment, obsession, and desperation, until the moment of eruption can no longer be contained. For Marissa Callahan, that moment arrived on a warm evening when her obsession could no longer exist within the confines of fantasy. She had crossed the threshold from yearning to action, from fixation to destruction. The woman who once imagined a future bound to Ryan Miller now envisioned a future where, if she could not have him, no one else could. The day of the act appeared ordinary to those around her. Neighbors saw her moving through her yard, tending briefly to tasks she had long neglected. She appeared calm, almost unnaturally composed, the kind of stillness that masks chaos brewing underneath. This quiet demeanor was deceptive. Inside her mind, every thought spiraled around Ryan. Every plan converged on the same conclusion. Her obsession had reached its terminal stage. She was no longer bound by reason, morality, or consequence. She was bound only by the need to make her fantasy real, no matter the cost. For weeks, she had studied Ryan's patterns. She knew his comings and goings, the rhythm of his days, the spaces where he was most vulnerable. She tracked his presence like prey, weaving her fixation into a strategy. To her, this was not an impulsive decision but a calculated one. She told herself that his rejection had forced her into this position, that her act would restore balance, that control could only be regained through finality. In her distorted logic, violence was not just an option. It was the only solution left. Ryan had done everything within his limited power to create distance. He had changed routes, limited exposure, and surrounded himself with support when possible. But obsession is patient, and patience is predatory. Marissa had the advantage of proximity, of knowledge, of determination unbound by reason. She was willing to wait, to linger, to seize the moment when Ryan would inevitably be exposed. And when the moment presented itself, she acted. The act of violence was not a chaotic outburst but a chillingly deliberate maneuver. Marissa carried with her the tools of finality, objects chosen not by accident but by intention. She knew what she intended to do, and she had rehearsed it in her mind countless times. To her, this was not murder. It was a twisted form of closure, an ending she believed was justified by the months of rejection and silence that had left her feeling powerless. The attack unfolded swiftly, a collision of pent-up rage and cold determination. Ryan, caught off guard, became the embodiment of every perceived betrayal she had endured. Her actions were relentless, driven not by passion, but by a calculated desire to erase the source of her torment. The setting, mundane in its familiarity, became the stage of horror, forever marked by the violence that transpired there. The brutality of the act shocked even those who later pieced together the timeline. It was not a singular blow or a sudden collapse but a sustained outpouring of aggression. Marissa's fixation had metastasized into hatred, and that hatred found its outlet in Ryan's destruction. Each movement was both physical and symbolic, an attempt to reclaim control by extinguishing the object of her obsession. In her mind, she was not committing an unforgivable act. She was enacting the inevitable conclusion of a story she believed she had been forced into. When the violence ceased, the silence that followed was suffocating. The reality of what she had done settled into the air like smoke after a fire. For a fleeting moment, she stood in the aftermath of her obsession, surrounded by the evidence of her own transformation. Ryan Miller, once the center of her fantasy, now lay as proof that her obsession had never been about love at all but about possession. The line she had crossed was permanent, and there was no path back. What Marissa did in those moments after the act revealed the depth of her delusion. Instead of shock or remorse, she felt a warped sense of completion. The act, in her mind, had sealed her narrative. She convinced herself that she had reclaimed control, that Ryan's silence could no longer torment her. But beneath this thin veneer of satisfaction, panic began to seep in. The reality of consequence crept closer with every passing second. No fantasy could shield her from the inevitability of discovery. Her attempt to manage the aftermath was clumsy and frantic. She tried to erase traces, to manipulate the scene, to rewrite what had transpired. Yet obsession had not made her meticulous, it had made her reckless. Evidence remained stark and undeniable. Her proximity to Ryan, her history of fixation, her erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to the act, all would weave together into a damning narrative. She had not created a perfect crime. She had created a perfect storm of suspicion. As the night deepened, the weight of her actions pressed against her. She oscillated between moments of grim satisfaction and waves of dread. She replayed the act in her mind, at times convincing herself it had been necessary, at other times suffocating under the recognition of its brutality. But regardless of her internal fluctuations, the external reality remained unchanged. Ryan Miller was dead, and Marissa Callahan was responsible. The act of violence did more than end a life. It fractured an entire community. Ryan was not an isolated figure. He was a son, a friend, a presence within the neighborhood. His sudden and violent end would ripple outward, shaking those who knew him, those who had seen the signs, those who had dismissed Marissa's instability as eccentricity rather than danger. The quiet suburb that once believed itself insulated from such horror was now marked by a crime that would never be forgotten. By the time dawn approached, the inevitability of discovery was undeniable. The narrative that Marissa had built in her mind was unraveling. No matter how she attempted to justify her actions, no matter how she clung to the belief that she had been driven by love, the reality was stark. She had crossed into darkness from which there was no return. Her obsession had not secured devotion. It had secured destruction. The act of violence was not merely the climax of her story. It was the unraveling of everything she had once been. It stripped away the facade of a devoted housewife, the illusion of a passionate affair, the fantasy of control. What remained was a woman consumed by obsession, a life reduced to ashes by the very desire she believed gave it meaning. And as the first light of morning broke, it became clear that the tragedy had only begun. The act of violence left Marissa Callahan standing in a reality she had not fully prepared for. Obsession had pushed her to commit the unthinkable, but the aftermath was something she could not control. The silence that followed Ryan Miller's final moments weighed heavier than any rejection ever had. For the first time, she realized she had moved from fantasy into permanence. There was no undoing, no erasing, no retreat. What lay before her was a choice between concealment and exposure. Panic, however, made concealment clumsy from the start. Marissa had never been a planner in the way a criminal mind must be. She had planned only in the abstract, rehearsing possibilities in her head without fully grasping the mess reality would bring. The scene was raw, chaotic, and incriminating. There were traces of her presence everywhere. Marks, prints, fibers, and above all, a timeline that linked her directly to the victim. Still, she attempted a cover-up, driven more by instinct than strategy. She wiped surfaces in haste, shifted objects in desperation, and tried to manipulate what could not truly be hidden. Each move betrayed her lack of foresight, leaving behind evidence more glaring than before. The cover-up extended beyond the physical scene. She scrambled to create explanations, stories she might tell if suspicion pointed her way. But her versions lacked coherence. They contradicted not only reality but her own past behavior. For months, her obsession with Ryan had been visible to many. Her constant presence near his home, her wandering eyes at social gatherings, her fixation in conversation. These were not easily erased. To claim distance would be laughable. To claim indifference would be unbelievable. Her reputation, once hidden behind the veneer of suburban normalcy, was already fractured beyond repair. She returned home with the weight of her actions pressing against her chest. Her hands shook. Her mind replayed the act in fragments, flashes of brutality that alternated between satisfaction and horror. She tried to behave as if nothing had changed, moving through her house with deliberate normalcy, but her family sensed the shift immediately. Daniel saw the agitation in her movements, the vacant look in her eyes, the way her body seemed present but her mind distant. Emily, too, sensed the unease, avoiding her mother's gaze with an instinct children often have for danger. For a brief window, Marissa believed she might still control the narrative. Ryan's absence could be explained. His life, independent and filled with routines, could allow for a delay before discovery. She imagined a period in which his disappearance would raise questions but not alarms, a span of time where she could refine her story. Yet obsession blinds its victims to reality. In truth, Ryan's absence was noticed almost immediately. He was not a man who vanished without word. Friends expected him. Family relied on him. Neighbors saw him daily. His sudden silence created ripples far sooner than Marissa had anticipated. The discovery began with concern. Messages unanswered. Calls ignored. A routine broken. What at first seemed like a missed appointment soon grew into alarm. Within a short time, Ryan's closest contacts knew something was wrong. They reached out to one another, piecing together his absence, comparing last sightings, and realizing that the young man who had once been vibrant and ever-present had simply vanished. Concern escalated to action. The first knocks came at his door. The first searches began around his home. It was not long before the grim reality became unavoidable. When Ryan's body was discovered, the impact was immediate and devastating. The violence was undeniable, the brutality evident. What should have been an ordinary life ended in horrific finality. The quiet neighborhood, once defined by manicured lawns and polite exchanges, now found itself marked by crime scene tape and flashing lights. The sense of security that had cocooned its residents was shattered in an instant. Word spread quickly, whispers turning to collective shock, shock turning to fear. The investigation began with methodical precision. Detectives surveyed the scene, gathering evidence that told its own story. The attempt at a cover-up was evident in the smears, the hurried disarray, the misplaced objects. Far from concealing the crime, Marissa's frantic actions had highlighted her presence. Forensic specialists collected samples, documented patterns, and built a picture of what had transpired. It became clear that this was not the work of an intruder or a stranger. This was intimate, deliberate, and personal. Suspicion began to focus almost immediately. Ryan's life was examined, his relationships scrutinized, his history unfolded in detail. Friends and family spoke of his distance in recent weeks, his attempts to avoid someone, his unease that had grown steadily over time. When the name Marissa Callahan surfaced, it carried weight. Neighbors recalled seeing her lingering near his home. Friends of Ryan mentioned her persistent attention. And within her own household, Daniel had long since recognized her fixation. The threads converged quickly, weaving a narrative that pointed directly at her. Marissa, meanwhile, clung to a crumbling sense of control. She watched the response unfold with growing dread, each development tightening the noose around her. She attempted to maintain composure, to deny knowledge, to present herself as uninvolved. But her demeanor betrayed her. The agitation, the inconsistencies in her accounts, the erratic way she moved through her days, all stood in stark contrast to the calm certainty of the evidence piling against her. The more she tried to appear distant, the more the truth pressed through the cracks. The discovery of Ryan's body had transformed the case from rumor into certainty. There was no longer speculation about his absence, no more hopeful assumptions of travel or escape. His end was undeniable, and the brutality spoke volumes. Investigators knew they were not searching for a faceless predator. They were searching for someone bound to him by obsession. In that pursuit, Marissa's name loomed larger with every passing hour. The cover-up, flawed and panicked, had bought her no time. Instead, it provided investigators with a trail to follow. The very attempt she made to erase herself had left markers, a breadcrumb path that drew suspicion closer. The discovery had not only exposed the crime but had begun the unmasking of the woman who believed she could turn fantasy into permanence. The illusion was collapsing, and with it, the life Marissa had once carefully constructed. What had begun as whispers of an affair and shadows of obsession now stood revealed as tragedy. The body was found. The investigation was underway. And Marissa Callahan's descent into darkness was no longer private. It was becoming the focus of an entire community, and soon the world beyond. The discovery of Ryan Miller's body marked a turning point. What had been speculation and whispered suspicion transformed into a formal homicide investigation. The brutality of the act demanded answers, and investigators moved with urgency. The suburban calm that once defined the neighborhood had been replaced by patrol cars, detectives, and forensic teams. For the community, shock lingered, but for investigators the focus was clear: identifying who had ended Ryan's life and why. From the outset, the evidence painted a picture of an intimate crime. The scene bore none of the hallmarks of a burglary or random attack. There was no forced entry, no theft, no evidence of a stranger's intrusion. Instead, the violence was direct and personal, carried out with sustained aggression. The placement of wounds, the proximity of struggle, the attempts at hurried concealment, all suggested someone who had been close to him, someone driven not by chance but by emotion. Investigators turned first to Ryan's personal life, mapping his relationships in detail. Friends were interviewed, family questioned, colleagues consulted. Patterns emerged quickly. Ryan, in the months leading up to his death, had shown clear signs of distress. He had spoken to some of distancing himself from a woman who would not leave him alone. He had shifted his routines, avoided certain places, and expressed concern about being followed. Though he never provided the full context, the fragments aligned into a recognizable story of unwanted pursuit. The name that surfaced again and again was Marissa Callahan. Neighbors recalled seeing her loitering near Ryan's home at unusual hours, her car parked conspicuously, her presence lingering long after any reasonable excuse could explain. Friends of Ryan mentioned her fixation, the way she directed her attention toward him in gatherings, the intensity that unsettled those around her. Her reputation had already begun to unravel in whispers, and now those whispers became statements in official records. Detectives pieced together a timeline. Marissa's movements in the days surrounding Ryan's death became the focus. Surveillance cameras in the neighborhood captured glimpses of her vehicle. Cell phone records placed her near Ryan's residence at critical hours. Witnesses recalled seeing her in the vicinity, some reporting her presence on the very evening the crime occurred. The evidence, though circumstantial at first, layered itself into a narrative that grew increasingly difficult to dismiss. Inside her own household, Marissa's unraveling had not gone unnoticed. Daniel Callahan had long understood that his wife's fixation on Ryan had crossed the line from inappropriate to dangerous. He had observed her late-night wanderings, her obsessive writings, her erratic behavior. In the days after Ryan's death, her demeanor shifted further into paranoia and agitation. Daniel, while protective of his daughter, knew that silence would no longer shield anyone. His statements to investigators only reinforced what others had observed. Marissa's obsession was not rumor but fact. The forensic evidence supported the growing suspicion. Traces recovered from the scene, fibers and prints, aligned with Marissa's presence. Attempts at wiping surfaces were evident but incomplete. The disarray bore the unmistakable mark of panic rather than precision. Every effort she had made to erase herself had instead highlighted her involvement. The cover-up, weak and desperate, had become one of the strongest pieces of evidence against her. The investigation also examined motive. Why Ryan? Why Marissa? The affair, once hidden, was unearthed through testimony and fragments of communication. Digital records revealed exchanges between the two, messages that began with flirtation but grew darker as Ryan sought distance. The intensity of Marissa's pursuit became undeniable in these records. Her words carried longing, then desperation and finally hostility. The progression from desire to obsession was documented in her own hand, an archive of fixation that prosecutors would later describe as a roadmap to murder. As the pieces aligned, investigators shifted from broad inquiry to narrow focus. Marissa Callahan was no longer a possibility, she was the primary suspect. Each layer of evidence, behavioral, circumstantial, forensic and testimonial, converged on her. The theory of the case became clear. An affair that had soured, an obsession that had deepened, a rejection that had spiraled into violence. Still, investigators moved carefully. A case built on obsession and circumstantial evidence needed to withstand scrutiny. They sought corroboration at every step. Neighbors provided consistent accounts. Surveillance placed her near the scene. Forensics tied her to the environment. Digital trails confirmed contact and intent. Piece by piece, the narrative solidified until doubt gave way to certainty. Meanwhile, the community watched the investigation unfold with disbelief. The notion that a respected housewife from their midst could be at the center of such horror shattered illusions of safety. Conversations shifted from shock to speculation to certainty. The Callahan name, once associated with suburban stability, became synonymous with scandal and violence. Marissa's isolation deepened, her attempts at maintaining normalcy collapsing under the weight of suspicion. Her own behavior during the investigation betrayed her further. Questioned by authorities, her accounts shifted, details contradicted, explanations faltered. At times she attempted indifference, claiming distance from Ryan. At other times her emotions spilled over, revealing the intensity that had driven her actions. Each inconsistency became another thread for investigators to pull, and each thread led back to the same conclusion. By the time weeks had passed since the discovery, the investigation had narrowed to a single focus. The evidence against Marissa Callahan was not only compelling but overwhelming. What had begun as whispers of an affair had hardened into proof of obsession, and what had begun as suspicion had crystallized into accusation. The investigation had achieved clarity. Ryan Miller's death was not the result of chance, nor was it the act of a faceless predator. It was the product of a relationship that should never have existed, a fixation that crossed into madness, and a woman who could not accept rejection. The path forward was inevitable. Marissa Callahan would be charged, and the story of the housewife whose obsession ended in murder would move from investigation to prosecution. The narrowing of the case did not bring closure but deepened the sense of tragedy. A young man's life had been ended. A family's world had been shattered. A community's sense of safety had been destroyed. And a woman who once lived behind the image of suburban respectability now stood revealed as a figure consumed by obsession and capable of violence beyond comprehension. The investigation had done its work. The story was no longer about mystery but about accountability. The next stage, the trial, would place Marissa's actions under the harsh light of judgment, exposing every detail of her descent. The months that followed became a tangled web of secrecy and desire that neither Margaret nor Ethan could fully control. What had begun as a reckless curiosity had now evolved into something far more consuming. The affair no longer felt like a temporary escape but rather a dangerous double life, one that required careful lies, hidden signals, and the constant fear of exposure. Every stolen encounter fueled the fire, while every brush with discovery heightened the risk. Margaret's home became the epicenter of this clandestine relationship. With Daniel often working long shifts or attending late-night gatherings with his colleagues, the house presented opportunities for Ethan to slip in unnoticed. At first, they had been cautious, arranging brief meetings in the shadow of secrecy, but as time passed, their confidence grew. The thrill of deception became almost as intoxicating as the affair itself. They reveled in the audacity of what they were doing, unaware that their arrogance was slowly unraveling the fragile safety net they believed they had woven. The neighbors, once indifferent to Margaret's quiet presence, began noticing subtle changes. Her appearance grew more polished, her clothes carefully chosen, her demeanor carrying an energy that was difficult to ignore. To some, it seemed as though she had rediscovered her youth, glowing with an allure that hadn't been visible in years. Yet beneath those surface-level compliments lay whispers. People began to wonder where this renewed spark had come from, though no one dared confront her directly. For Ethan, the relationship became a consuming obsession. He was young, impulsive, and driven by desires he could barely comprehend. Margaret represented not only passion but also a forbidden conquest that elevated his sense of self. The secrecy made him feel powerful, as though he had stolen something sacred from the man next door. Each rendezvous was a triumph, a reminder that he had lured someone into breaking vows and crossing lines that could never be uncrossed. Yet beneath the confidence, there lingered insecurities and doubts that Margaret struggled to soothe. Margaret herself was caught in a storm of conflicting emotions. On one hand, she felt alive in ways she had not for years. Ethan's attention made her feel valued, seen, and desired in a way her marriage no longer provided. On the other hand, the weight of guilt grew heavier with every passing week. Each time Daniel kissed her forehead before leaving for work, each time he asked about her day with gentle concern, She felt the sharp pang of betrayal. The life she had built, the stability she had once cherished, was slowly crumbling beneath the choices she made in secret. The dynamic between Margaret and Ethan shifted as the affair deepened. What had once been lighthearted and playful began to take on darker undertones. Ethan, emboldened by their continued secrecy, became more possessive. He questioned Margaret's loyalty, probing into the details of her marriage and demanding reassurances that she would never leave him behind. Margaret, caught between the responsibilities of her household and the desires of her heart, found herself cornered by his intensity. The thrill was slowly being replaced by fear. Despite the mounting tension, neither of them could walk away. The affair had become a cycle, feeding off both passion and paranoia. They told themselves they could manage it, that they were clever enough to keep it hidden, but the cracks were beginning to show. One misplaced text message, one unexplained absence, one suspicious glance from a neighbor. Any of these could unravel everything. Daniel remained unaware, or at least appeared to be. His trust in Margaret was deep, and his focus on his career and household routines kept him distracted. Yet there were moments when Margaret caught him studying her a little too long, as though he sensed something he could not yet articulate. The silence of suspicion often speaks louder than accusations, and Margaret could feel the shift even if Daniel never voiced it. She began to wonder how much longer she could keep him in the dark. Meanwhile, Ethan's family had started noticing changes as well. His mother commented on his frequent absences, his father questioned his late nights, and his friends mocked his secrecy. He brushed them off with casual lies, but their curiosity grew. Living under the same roof, his parents were bound to notice eventually. Every slip of his demeanor risked exposure, and yet Ethan's arrogance convinced him he could handle it. He underestimated how fragile the mask truly was. The relationship, once thrilling, had become a pressure cooker. Every day added another layer of risk, another chance for discovery. Margaret lay awake at night, tormented by visions of what would happen if the truth emerged. Divorce, humiliation, violence. Any outcome seemed possible. Yet in the morning, when Ethan's messages appeared on her phone, she found herself unable to resist. It was as though she was addicted, trapped in a cycle that she knew would destroy her but powerless to stop. The turning point came quietly, in ways neither of them recognized at first. Ethan's possessiveness deepened, and Margaret's fear grew. She no longer saw him only as a source of passion, but also as a looming threat to the stability of her world. His temper flared when she hesitated, his questions turned sharp when she tried to create distance. What had once been excitement now carried the weight of danger, and Margaret could feel herself losing control of the situation she had once thought she could manage. The affair was no longer just a secret, it was a ticking time bomb. Every encounter, every stolen kiss, every whispered goodbye carried the shadow of consequences that neither wanted to face. And yet, despite the fear, despite the guilt, they both continued. They were bound together by something they could neither define nor escape, spiraling deeper into a darkness that would soon demand a price. As the weeks stretched on, the walls of secrecy grew thinner. The whispers among the neighbors became louder, the tension in Margaret's home more palpable, and the desperation in Ethan's eyes more intense. The stage was quietly being set for something irreversible, though neither of them could see it clearly yet. The seeds of destruction had been sown, and it was only a matter of time before they took root. Margaret stood at the edge of a precipice, torn between the life she had built and the desire she could not let go of. Ethan, blind to the consequences, pulled her closer to the edge with every reckless decision. The world around them was beginning to notice, and soon, the silence of suspicion would give way to the chaos of revelation. The story that had started as a forbidden passion was slowly transforming into a tragedy in the making. And as the quiet town carried on with its daily routines, unaware of the storm brewing in its midst, the affair edged closer to the point of no return. The slow unraveling of Margaret's life continued with an almost invisible persistence, creeping into every corner of her existence. What had once been carefully balanced between the comfort of her marriage and the excitement of her secret encounters was now becoming unsustainable. The lies required more effort, the explanations grew thinner, and the weight of what she carried pressed on her with relentless force. Every day began to feel like a performance, and she no longer knew how long she could keep up the act. Ethan's presence in her life was no longer discreet or occasional. It had become demanding, insistent, and suffocating. He expected her to find ways to see him, to rearrange her days and make sacrifices to feed his desires. Margaret found herself checking her phone constantly, deleting messages, hiding evidence of their meetings. The nervous energy of secrecy was eroding her peace of mind. She could no longer enjoy a simple meal with Daniel without fearing that a careless word, a misplaced glance, or an unexpected phone vibration might betray everything. The neighbors' whispers grew sharper with time. What had once been vague speculation began to take form as suspicion. Margaret noticed lingering stares when she passed through the neighborhood, subtle changes in greetings, and hushed conversations that stopped when she approached. She could sense that her behavior had been noticed, even if no one dared to confront her openly. The pressure of living in a close-knit community only magnified the danger. It was no longer a matter of if her secret would be discovered, but when. Ethan himself became increasingly reckless. Youth and arrogance convinced him he was untouchable. He flaunted his late-night absences, brushed off his parents' concerns, and grew bolder in pursuing Margaret even during times when discovery was highly possible. He thrived on the adrenaline, convinced it was proof of their unbreakable bond. Yet his carelessness added layers of risk that Margaret could no longer ignore. She began to fear not only for her marriage but for her reputation, her standing in the community, and the stability of the life she had spent years creating. At home, Daniel remained outwardly steady, though Margaret felt a shift in his demeanor. He was quieter, more observant, and at times strangely withdrawn. He asked fewer questions about her day, yet his silences carried an unspoken weight. Margaret often wondered if he suspected more than he let on, if his loyalty and patience had begun to fray beneath the surface. Every moment in his presence became an exercise in restraint, her heart pounding with the fear that he might one day confront her with the truth. The affair itself was no longer as intoxicating as it had once been. The thrill of secrecy had been replaced by dread, and the moments of passion were clouded by anxiety. Margaret felt herself torn between two lives, unable to fully commit to either. She longed for the safety of her marriage yet could not sever her tie to Ethan. It was as though she was caught in a trap of her own making, unable to move forward or backward without destroying something in the process. Ethan's demands only worsened the situation. He wanted more of her time, more assurances of her loyalty, more promises of a future together. He began to talk about Daniel not as an obstacle but as a threat to what they shared. His possessiveness, once flattering, now felt dangerous. Margaret realized that the boy she had once seen as an escape had become a source of fear. His intensity frightened her, yet she lacked the strength to pull away completely. The relationship had become a chain, binding her to a course she no longer controlled. In moments of solitude, Margaret's mind turned dark. She imagined what would happen if Daniel discovered everything. She pictured the humiliation of neighbors learning the truth, the collapse of her marriage, and the devastation that would follow. These thoughts consumed her, leaving her restless and hollow. Sleep became elusive, and when it came it was filled with nightmares of exposure and ruin. Her health began to show the strain. She grew thinner, her face lined with worry, her energy drained by the weight of her choices. Daniel noticed, commenting on her fatigue and urging her to rest, but his concern only deepened her guilt. Ethan noticed as well, though his response was harsher. He accused her of pulling away, of losing interest, of betraying the bond they had forged. His words cut deep, leaving Margaret torn between defending herself and resenting him for his lack of understanding. The dynamic had shifted irreversibly. What had once been a secret indulgence had become a volatile and destructive force. Ethan's passion was no longer enough to sustain Margaret's desire, and Margaret's fear was no longer enough to restrain Ethan's obsession. They were moving toward a breaking point, each unable to see the consequences clearly, yet both aware that something terrible was inevitable. The town around them continued in its ordinary rhythm, unaware of the storm brewing within its quiet streets. Yet Margaret could no longer see her world as ordinary. Every glance, every word, every silence felt charged with suspicion. She lived in a state of constant tension, waiting for the moment when everything would collapse. And collapse it would. The secrets had been kept for too long, the lies too deeply woven, the emotions too volatile. The affair had started as a reckless act of passion, but it was transforming into something far more dangerous. Margaret knew it, Ethan ignored it, and Daniel, whether consciously or not, seemed to sense it. The trajectory of their lives was shifting, inching closer toward disaster with every passing day. As winter crept into the town, the atmosphere in Margaret's home grew colder as well. The warmth of stability had been replaced by the chill of distrust, secrecy, and fear. Margaret found herself staring at her reflection, barely recognizing the woman she had become. She was no longer the housewife seeking escape from monotony. She was a woman trapped in a nightmare of her own creation. The end was drawing near, even if none of them could yet define it. The weight of secrecy, the intensity of obsession, and the fragility of human control were converging. The affair was no longer sustainable, and the choices made in desperation would soon carve a path that could never be undone. The seeds of tragedy had been planted long ago, and now slowly they began to take root. The passage of time only deepened the fault lines that had been carved into Margaret's life. The dual existence she maintained was no longer hidden behind a polished facade of domestic stability. It was cracking, fragile, and increasingly visible to those who cared to look closely. The secrecy that once gave her a thrill now brought only exhaustion. Each day she carried the burden of deception heavier than the last, and each night she lay awake knowing that the walls were closing in around her. Ethan's behavior grew more erratic. What had begun as excitement and adventure on his part turned into relentless fixation. He demanded constant contact, growing angry if Margaret did not answer his messages quickly enough or failed to meet him when he insisted. His youthful arrogance had shifted into obsession, and his inability to control his emotions left Margaret feeling trapped. The allure that had once drawn her to him was buried beneath layers of possessiveness and volatility. He was no longer the escape she sought. He had become a cage. Margaret attempted to create distance, but each effort only fueled Ethan's desperation. He accused her of abandoning him, of choosing Daniel over him, of betraying the promises she had made. His words became sharper, his tone darker, and Margaret began to sense the danger that lingered in his anger. What had once been whispers of passion now carried the weight of threats, subtle at first, but unmistakable in intent. Ethan's need for control was growing, and Margaret feared that it would soon erupt into something beyond her ability to contain. The tension in her marriage intensified as well. Daniel's suspicion, though unspoken, was becoming clearer with each passing day. He studied her with quiet intensity, noticing the changes in her habits, her distracted nature, the inconsistencies in her stories. He did not confront her outright, but the silence between them grew heavier. Margaret felt the distance widening, and with it came the gnawing fear that Daniel might already know more than he revealed. His restraint frightened her even more than the possibility of confrontation, because it suggested a patience that could give way to something far more dangerous if provoked. The community around them became increasingly watchful. Margaret felt the eyes of her neighbors upon her, catching the subtle shifts in their behavior. Friendly smiles were replaced with cautious glances, casual conversations tinged with curiosity. The gossip that had begun as idle speculation was now sharpening into something closer to certainty. The pressure of living under that scrutiny added another layer of fear to Margaret's already fragile state. Every step outside her home felt like walking on a stage where every movement was judged. Inside her own mind, Margaret fought a losing battle. She still clung to the fragments of passion that had once made the affair feel worth the risk, but those fragments were buried beneath fear and regret. She longed for the stability of her marriage, the comfort of a predictable life, yet the choices she had made chained her to a dangerous secret that could not be undone. The guilt consumed her, but it was Ethan's unpredictability that truly haunted her. She no longer trusted him, no longer felt safe in his presence, yet she could not find the strength to sever the connection completely. Ethan, blind to the destruction he was causing, grew more insistent. He began to pressure Margaret with talk of a future together, pressing her to leave Daniel and build a new life by his side. To him, the affair was no longer enough. He wanted permanence, ownership, and proof that Margaret belonged only to him. Margaret, torn between fear and indecision, offered vague reassurances, knowing that any outright rejection might provoke a reaction she could not control. She lived in constant dread of his next demand, his next outburst, his next reckless decision that could expose everything. Her health continued to deteriorate under the strain. She lost weight, her face grew pale, her eyes hollow. The woman who had once carried herself with renewed confidence now appeared worn and fragile. Daniel noticed, his concern shadowed by suspicion. He offered comfort but withheld trust, a combination that only deepened Margaret's torment. She no longer knew if she was protecting him from the truth, or if he was protecting himself from confirming what he already suspected. The fragile balance of secrecy was unraveling quickly. One misstep, one careless action could topple everything. Ethan, with his recklessness, was the greatest threat to that balance. Margaret knew it, yet she could not control him. His obsession drove him to take risks that terrified her, appearing unannounced, speaking carelessly, pushing boundaries that could no longer be hidden. His presence was no longer a secret companion, but a looming shadow that threatened to consume her entire life. As winter deepened, so too did the darkness in Margaret's mind. She found herself envisioning outcomes she once could never have imagined. The possibility of exposure haunted her, the fear of losing her marriage and her reputation overwhelmed her, and the looming threat of Ethan's obsession terrified her. She began to see no escape, no path forward that did not end in ruin. The walls of her double life had closed in so tightly that she could barely breathe. The story of her affair had begun with passion, but now it was dominated by fear. Ethan's possessiveness, Daniel's silence, the community's suspicion. All of it converged to create a storm that Margaret could not navigate. She had lost control of the narrative, lost control of her choices, and was now carried along by forces that seemed inevitable. The affair had transformed from an escape into a trap, and the consequences of that transformation were drawing nearer with every passing day. The seeds of violence had already been sown. Ethan's anger, Margaret's fear, and Daniel's quiet watchfulness created a volatile triangle, one that could not hold indefinitely. Something would break, and when it did, the destruction would be absolute. Margaret could sense it even if she could not name it. The end was approaching, and it would come not with whispers but with chaos. The quiet town remained unaware of the full extent of what was unfolding, but the undercurrents were strong. The life Margaret had once known was already gone, replaced by a nightmare of secrecy, obsession, and fear. And as the days passed, the inevitability of tragedy grew sharper. The choices she had made had set her on a course that could no longer be altered. The spiral toward violence was underway, and there was no turning back. The tightening grip of secrecy was reaching a point of suffocation, and Margaret felt herself sinking deeper into a labyrinth with no way out. Her life had become a constant performance of lies layered upon lies, every day carefully orchestrated to maintain appearances. But beneath the facade, her world was in chaos. Each choice, each encounter with Ethan, each silence from Daniel, chipped away at what little stability remained. She was living on the edge of exposure, and with each passing day the fall seemed inevitable. Ethan's obsession was no longer hidden beneath charm or excitement. It had grown into something darker, something Margaret could no longer ignore. His temper flared easily, his words carried threats masked as declarations of love, and his behavior became increasingly intrusive. He no longer respected boundaries or caution. He appeared at her home without warning, lingered near places she frequented, and demanded that she acknowledge his presence in ways that risked discovery. His need for her was consuming, and it frightened her. Margaret tried to create distance, but her half-hearted attempts only made things worse. Ethan interpreted any hesitation as betrayal, responding with anger that bordered on dangerous. He accused her of stringing him along, of choosing Daniel, of failing to commit fully to the promises he believed she had made. Margaret found herself caught between his demands and her fear, forced to placate him to avoid escalation while silently wishing she could sever the bond completely. The relationship had shifted from passion to coercion, and the weight of it pressed down on her until she could hardly breathe. At home, the silence from Daniel was becoming unbearable. He did not confront her, yet his eyes seemed to carry unspoken knowledge. He watched her closely, his questions few but deliberate, and Margaret felt as though he was testing her, waiting for her to reveal herself. His restraint made her anxious, and every moment in his presence became an exercise in control. She could not tell if he was truly oblivious or if he was gathering evidence, biding his time until he chose to act. The uncertainty gnawed at her, leaving her sleepless and restless. The gossip among neighbors grew more pointed. Margaret could sense the shift in the way people spoke to her. Their words laced with insinuation, their expressions betraying curiosity they tried to conceal. The walls of secrecy she had built were thinning, and she knew it. The community that once seemed indifferent now felt like a tribunal, silently judging her every move. She avoided gatherings, limited her interactions, and withdrew further into herself, but even isolation could not protect her from the scrutiny that lingered in the air. Margaret's mental state deteriorated under the weight of it all. She became consumed by fear, imagining scenarios of exposure and ruin at every turn. She envisioned Daniel discovering the truth, the neighbors confirming their suspicions, Ethan's obsession erupting into violence. Each possibility felt not only likely but imminent. She lived in constant anticipation of disaster, her nerves frayed, her health visibly declining. The woman she once was had all but vanished, replaced by a hollow shell barely held together by desperation. Ethan, blind to her suffering, continued to escalate. His possessiveness turned into ultimatums. He demanded she choose him, leave Daniel, and make their relationship public. He insisted that their secrecy was no longer enough, that if she truly loved him, she would sever her marriage and commit fully to him. Margaret knew such a step would destroy her life entirely, yet the fear of his anger made her hesitate to refuse outright. She gave vague reassurances, promises she had no intention of keeping, but Ethan clung to them as if they were binding. The tension between the three of them, Margaret, Ethan, and Daniel, formed a volatile triangle. Each carried knowledge or suspicion, each driven by emotions that were unstable and dangerous. Ethan's obsession, Margaret's fear, and Daniel's silence created a pressure cooker that could not remain contained. The balance of power was shifting, and the sense of inevitability grew stronger with each passing day. Something was building, a storm gathering momentum that would soon break. Margaret's health reflected the turmoil within. Her body weakened, her eyes lost their brightness, and her movements carried the weight of exhaustion. Even the simplest tasks became burdensome, her energy drained by constant anxiety. Daniel noticed and pressed her to see a doctor, but Margaret deflected, unwilling to risk any probing that might uncover the truth. Her decline was not medical but psychological, the direct consequence of the secrets she carried and the dangers that surrounded her. As the days passed, Margaret began to sense that time was running out. She could no longer manage Ethan's demands, Daniel's silence, and the community's suspicion simultaneously. Each layer of her life was unraveling, and she had no control over the pace. The affair had ceased to be about passion long ago. Now it was about survival. She lived not with excitement but with dread, her every decision driven by the need to avoid disaster for one more day. The inevitability of exposure haunted her. She began to prepare herself mentally for the collapse she knew was coming. Whether it would be Daniel confronting her, Ethan forcing her hand, or the neighbors uncovering the truth, she could not say. But she felt it pressing closer, an unavoidable reckoning that loomed on the horizon. Each hour felt like a countdown, and Margaret knew she could not stop the clock. Ethan's obsession and Daniel's growing suspicion were on a collision course, and she was trapped between them. No matter what choice she made, destruction seemed certain. The affair that once made her feel alive was now the very thing draining the life from her. She had created a trap from which there was no escape, and the walls of that trap were closing in with terrifying speed. As the cold of winter settled over the town, Margaret's world grew darker still. The warmth of passion had long since faded, replaced by shadows of fear and regret. The path she had taken had led her here, to a point where every step forward carried her closer to catastrophe. The spiral had begun, and there was no turning back. The storm was coming, and Margaret could feel it in every breath, every heartbeat, every sleepless night. The choices she had made had set her fate in motion, and soon the consequences would come crashing down with devastating force. The weeks following the failed confrontation settled into an unsettling quiet that felt more dangerous than any argument. The silence between Evelyn and Mark grew heavier, as though both were waiting for the other to make a move. It was a silence filled not with peace, but with strategy, tension, and unspoken resentment. Every look carried a message, every gesture hinted at something beneath the surface. To the outside world, life appeared almost normal. Neighbors saw Evelyn tending her garden, Mark washing his car, the rhythm of suburban life seemingly intact. But behind the closed doors of Evelyn's home, the air was thick with suspicion and calculation. Mark, feeling the sting of Evelyn's manipulation, began to retreat inward. He no longer reached out with the same reckless enthusiasm. Instead, he studied Evelyn more carefully, watching her words, her habits, and her routines. He felt used, and that feeling brewed into something darker. Though still infatuated, his passion was no longer entirely about desire. It was shifting into obsession, something that bordered on resentment. He told himself that he needed Evelyn, but beneath that thought lingered another. He could not trust her, and he would not allow himself to be destroyed by her choices. Evelyn, on the other hand, sensed the change in him. She noticed how he lingered longer than necessary, how his gaze sharpened when she spoke, how he seemed to be measuring her rather than admiring her. For Evelyn, this presented both an opportunity and a danger. The thrill she once felt had begun to fade. The affair, once exhilarating, now felt suffocating. Mark's presence loomed larger than she had anticipated, and her ability to control him seemed to be slipping. His youth and passion had been intoxicating, but his unpredictability was becoming a liability. Her marriage to Thomas, though strained, was not collapsing. Thomas remained blissfully unaware of her double life, or at least unwilling to confront the suspicions he buried beneath layers of denial. He had begun to notice her absences, her mood swings, and the faint traces of something different in her demeanor, but he chalked it up to stress or loneliness. He had grown comfortable in the routines of his work, and trusted the image of stability that Evelyn projected. That trust, however, was fragile. Evelyn began to consider her future more critically. She realized that she could not continue living in two worlds indefinitely. Her desire for excitement clashed with her need for security. Ending things with Mark outright felt dangerous, yet continuing down the current path felt equally untenable. She started weighing options in the privacy of her thoughts, imagining ways to free herself without consequence. But the more she calculated, the more she underestimated the depths of Mark's shifting emotions. For Mark, each passing day fueled a growing storm inside him. He felt betrayed not just by Evelyn's reluctance to leave her husband, but by the way she treated him like a pawn in her own narrative. His youthful arrogance, once overshadowed by desire, now hardened into indignation. He began to envision scenarios where he could reclaim control, where he could assert himself in ways that would force Evelyn to acknowledge his importance. This was no longer about romance, it was about power. Subtle changes marked the beginning of his descent. He became more possessive, demanding more of her time, sending messages that carried a sharper edge. His presence at her home, once thrilling, now carried a sense of intrusion. Evelyn tried to manage him, offering half-truths and small reassurances, but her words only fueled his paranoia. He began to suspect that she was preparing to cast him aside. That suspicion, once planted, grew rapidly into a conviction. Meanwhile, Evelyn's anxieties multiplied. She grew wary of her neighbors, concerned that someone might notice the strange comings and goings. Every car that slowed on the street, every glance from across the fence, felt like a threat. She began to wonder if Thomas truly suspected more than he let on. Her carefully curated world of appearances was starting to feel unstable, as though at any moment the facade might crumble. At night, Evelyn lay awake considering her choices. She imagined confessing to Thomas, though she quickly dismissed the thought, knowing the destruction it would cause. She imagined ending things with Mark gently, perhaps by creating distance until the affair faded into memory. Yet even as she entertained these options, she knew deep down that Mark would not let go so easily. The boy she once saw as malleable had grown into something unpredictable, perhaps even dangerous. Mark's resentment deepened when he saw Evelyn with Thomas. Simple gestures, Thomas holding her hand, Thomas speaking to her with familiarity, cut him deeply. He began to interpret Evelyn's every move as betrayal, convinced she was toying with him while maintaining her comfortable life. His obsession, now mingled with anger, began to take on a darker shape. The thought of losing her felt unbearable, but so too did the thought of being strung along indefinitely. He felt trapped, and his youthful impulsiveness sought an outlet. The community around them remained oblivious. The neighborhood continued its daily rhythms, children playing in yards, families gathering for barbecues, lives unfolding in the quiet safety of suburban streets. Yet beneath that ordinary exterior, a volatile situation was reaching its boiling point. Evelyn and Mark were locked in a silent struggle, each calculating, each uncertain, yet both moving toward an inevitable breaking point. As the tension mounted, Evelyn began to retreat emotionally, while Mark pushed harder. She avoided his gaze in public, limited their private encounters, and started to build walls where once she had thrown open doors. For Mark, these rejections were intolerable. His ego, bruised and inflamed, demanded action. He began to dwell on darker fantasies, envisioning ways to break free of the humiliation he felt, ways to force Evelyn into the permanence he desired. The seeds of violence had been planted, though neither fully acknowledged it. What began as passion had mutated into obsession and fear. Evelyn's calculations became more desperate, Mark's thoughts more volatile. The line between desire and destruction was thinning, and soon it would vanish altogether. The stage was set, the players locked in place. What followed would not be a gradual unraveling, but a sharp descent into chaos. The fragile balance between secrecy and exposure was crumbling, and with it, the illusion of control that Evelyn had clung to so tightly. The silence that once masked their affair was about to be shattered, and when it broke, it would leave behind a trail of devastation far beyond anything either of them had imagined. The next chapter would not be about hesitation or planning, it would be about consequences. The uneasy quiet that followed Evelyn's attempts to distance herself did little to calm the growing storm within Mark. Rejection was not something he could accept, not after the promises, the secrecy, and the emotional control that had defined their relationship. In his mind, Evelyn had created a bond that could not be severed simply because she willed it. Every hour he spent apart from her was consumed by suspicion, jealousy, and the gnawing fear that she was slipping away. These thoughts did not fade with time. They intensified, carving a darker path in his mind where rationality no longer held sway. Mark began to live in extremes. One moment, he convinced himself that Evelyn still loved him, that her coldness was merely an act of fear or guilt. The next, he was certain she had betrayed him, laughing behind his back while continuing her comfortable life with Thomas. These swings between hope and fury eroded any balance he once had. He started following her routines, memorizing her patterns, and noting every slight change in her behavior. Each detail became evidence, each action either proof of loyalty or confirmation of betrayal. He was no longer just a secret lover. He was a watcher, circling her life with relentless attention. Evelyn, meanwhile, was caught in the tightening grip of her own anxiety. The affair had begun as a thrill, but now it felt like a chain dragging her deeper into a dangerous abyss. She could sense Mark's obsession growing, the way his eyes lingered with a possessive intensity, the tone of his messages carrying a weight that unsettled her. She had underestimated him, dismissing his youth as a guarantee of pliability. But now she realized that she had awakened something volatile in him, something that no longer felt within her control. Her attempts to create distance only fueled his paranoia. Ignored messages became proof of disloyalty. Cancelled plans transformed into imagined betrayals. Mark's obsession twisted every absence into a narrative of rejection. He began to imagine Evelyn and Thomas together, laughing at his expense, using him as a disposable distraction. The thought of being discarded filled him with humiliation, and humiliation, for Mark, quickly transformed into anger. The anger did not stay contained. It seeped into his thoughts, reshaping his fantasies. Where once he dreamed of a future with Evelyn, of her leaving her husband and starting anew, he now envisioned darker outcomes. If he could not have her fully, then perhaps no one else should. These were not fleeting thoughts but recurring images, feeding off his wounded pride and deepening obsession. They became the lens through which he viewed every interaction, until the line between imagination and intention began to blur. Evelyn sensed this shift but told herself she could manage it. She believed that if she carefully withdrew, if she softened her rejection, he would eventually move on. But she miscalculated the depth of his fixation. For Mark, Evelyn was no longer just a lover. She had become the center of his identity, the justification for his rebellion against the life he had known. To lose her would be to lose himself, and that was something he could not allow. At the same time, Evelyn's marriage with Thomas carried on under the veneer of stability. Thomas remained unaware of the true danger simmering beneath his own roof. He noticed Evelyn's distance but interpreted it as stress, or perhaps boredom. He did not suspect that another man lurked at the heart of her shifting moods. This ignorance provided Evelyn with temporary cover, but it also gave her the illusion that she could still navigate both worlds without consequence. That illusion would soon prove fatal. Mark's behavior grew more erratic. He began to appear unexpectedly, lurking near Evelyn's home, waiting for glimpses of her through windows or chance sightings in the neighborhood. What had once been secret meetings fueled by desire had now turned into surveillance fueled by desperation. He justified it to himself as love, as proof of his devotion. In reality, it was a descent into dangerous obsession, a behavior that tightened his hold on Evelyn even as she tried to break free. Evelyn's fear grew, though she tried to bury it beneath composure. She found herself looking over her shoulder more often, questioning the safety of her carefully constructed life. Yet she hesitated to take drastic action. Admitting the truth to Thomas was unthinkable, and confronting Mark directly carried its own risks. She told herself that if she remained cautious, if she managed her words carefully, she could keep the situation from spiraling further. But by then it was already spiraling beyond her control. The more Evelyn withdrew, the more Mark's anger solidified. He no longer sought only her affection. He craved power, vindication, and permanence. He convinced himself that she owed him, that her reluctance was not rejection but cowardice. In his mind, he was the one who had risked everything, the one who had sacrificed, the one who deserved her loyalty above all else. And if she would not give it willingly, he would take it by force. This mindset marked a pivotal shift. The affair was no longer about forbidden passion. It had transformed into a dangerous game of control and possession. Evelyn's fear and Mark's obsession were colliding, creating a volatile mix that could only end in destruction. The suburban calm that surrounded them was nothing more than a fragile mask hiding the storm that had been building for months. By the end of that quiet season, the stage was set for tragedy. Evelyn, still clinging to the hope of disentangling herself, failed to recognize how deeply Mark's obsession had taken root. Mark, consumed by his need to reclaim power, saw no path forward that did not involve confrontation. The invisible line between secrecy and exposure, between desire and violence, was vanishing rapidly. What had once been a reckless affair was now something far more sinister. The momentum toward disaster was undeniable, and both Evelyn and Mark were being pulled along, unable or unwilling to stop. Their fates were already intertwined, not in love, but in obsession and impending violence. The fragile equilibrium had shattered. What lay ahead was not reconciliation, nor escape, but the inevitable collision of fear, anger, and betrayal. The quiet before the storm had ended. The boundaries that once separated Evelyn's double life from her outward existence began to dissolve completely. What had been carefully hidden in shadows was now bleeding into her everyday reality, and she felt the weight of it pressing harder with each passing day. The tension between her and Mark had become unbearable, a constant reminder that her choices were no longer her own. The quiet streets of the neighborhood, once a symbol of safety and order, now carried a different meaning. They were the stage where a dangerous game of obsession and control was being played out behind closed doors. Mark's transformation was nearly complete. The young man who had once been flattered and enthralled by the attention of an older woman was gone. In his place stood someone hardened by resentment, twisted by a need to reclaim dignity through domination. He no longer approached Evelyn with the reckless innocence of desire. His thoughts had turned predatory, his actions carefully sharpened by the belief that she belonged to him. Each encounter, each rejection, reinforced the idea that he was entitled to something she was withholding. The control Evelyn had once enjoyed was gone. She had built her sense of power on Mark's youth and naivety, assuming she could direct his emotions at will. But that illusion had collapsed. Instead of letting go, he clung tighter, suffocating her attempts to escape with persistence that bordered on harassment. He waited in the spaces between her life, outside her home, near the grocery store, parked down the street where his presence could not be ignored. He had become a shadow, and that shadow carried with it a threat she could feel in her bones. Evelyn tried to recalibrate. She grew more meticulous in how she managed her appearances, taking care to disguise her unease from Thomas, who remained oblivious to the gravity of the situation. She avoided unnecessary conversations with neighbors, worried that any stray remark might give away what had been happening. Yet her composure was fragile. Behind her carefully painted smile was fear, and behind her routines was the growing awareness that Mark was no longer someone she could manipulate. The intensity of Mark's fixation escalated to new extremes. He began to fantasize not only about Evelyn's loyalty, but about eliminating the obstacles that stood in his way. Thomas, once an afterthought, became a target of his jealousy. In Mark's distorted reasoning, Thomas was the thief who had stolen what rightfully belonged to him. The idea of Evelyn's marriage no longer represented a barrier to seduction. It had become the enemy that needed to be destroyed. He told himself that Evelyn's hesitation was not about lack of love but about fear of change, and if that obstacle were removed, she would have no choice but to turn fully toward him. This logic marked a dangerous shift from obsession to violence. Where once Mark had been content with stolen hours and hidden touches, now he demanded permanence. He began imagining himself not as Evelyn's secret, but as her rightful partner, the one who would replace Thomas and claim the life he believed he deserved. These fantasies were not fleeting. They were recurring, persistent, and increasingly convincing to him. The more he indulged them, the closer they drifted toward becoming plans. Evelyn, despite her fears, underestimated how far Mark was willing to go. She still believed that time and careful distance might cause his attachment to fade. She thought of him as reckless, impulsive, a young man blinded by infatuation. What she failed to see was that his impulsiveness had evolved into calculation. He was no longer reacting to her. He was plotting, envisioning a future that required decisive and irreversible action. Her world at home remained deceptively calm. Thomas carried on with his routines, content in the familiarity of his work and home life. To him, Evelyn's distracted behavior was a temporary phase, the kind of ebb and flow that occurred in long marriages. He did not press her with questions, nor did he suspect the web of lies that had been spun beneath their roof. That silence gave Evelyn cover, but it also left her isolated. The one person who could have protected her had no idea she was in danger, and she lacked the courage to confess the truth. Mark's anger simmered beneath the surface, waiting for an outlet. Every glance of Evelyn with her husband, every hint of her withdrawal, fanned the flames of his fury. He began to keep mental tallies of her betrayals, how many times she had ignored his calls, how many excuses she had made, how often she had chosen Thomas over him. These tallies fed his growing sense of righteousness. To him, he was not the villain. He was the wronged party, the man fighting for what was his. The weight of secrecy became unbearable for Evelyn. She felt trapped in a maze of her own making, where every exit led to disaster. If she confessed, she would lose her marriage and reputation. If she continued, she risked Mark's increasingly dangerous obsession consuming her life. And if she ended things, she feared the unpredictable rage he carried within him. Each option was a dead end, and the walls of her carefully crafted life were closing in with suffocating force. As weeks turned into months, the tension no longer ebbed and flowed. It escalated steadily, building toward an inevitable climax. The affair had long ceased to be a private indiscretion. It had become a ticking clock, each moment bringing them closer to exposure, confrontation, and violence. The balance of power had shifted entirely. Evelyn was no longer the orchestrator of secrecy. She was a prisoner of it. Mark was no longer the boy she toyed with. He was a man on the edge of a decision that would shatter lives. The darkness of their choices had reached a point where retreat was no longer possible. Evelyn's attempts to regain control only deepened Mark's conviction that drastic measures were necessary. The air between them was thick with unspoken threats, their lives moving in a trajectory neither could stop. The quiet suburb, with its manicured lawns and cheerful facades, was unknowingly housing a storm that would soon break in violence. The affair was no longer about passion or rebellion. It had transformed into a deadly bond, a dangerous tether that neither could sever. Evelyn's fear and Mark's obsession were pulling them both toward a collision, and the moment of impact was drawing near. Each passing day brought them closer to the breaking point, where secrecy would no longer protect them, and the choices they had made would finally demand their price. The silence before the explosion was nearly over. What came next would be irreversible. The shift from secrecy to danger became undeniable, when Mark's obsession began manifesting in tangible ways. He no longer confined his fixation to thoughts or private fantasies. Instead, he started leaving behind traces of his presence, subtle yet unmistakable signs that Evelyn could not ignore. A car parked too long near her house, footprints in the garden after a night's rain, a lingering scent of cigarette smoke when she knew no one in her family smoked. These details unsettled her, each one a reminder that she was being watched, that she was no longer in control of how and when their connection surfaced. For Evelyn, the realization was chilling. The relationship she once believed she controlled had slipped entirely from her grasp. What had been a source of excitement was now a source of dread, and the thrill that once drew her to Mark had been replaced by fear of what he was capable of. She tried to rationalize these intrusions, telling herself that he was simply desperate, that his youth made him reckless. But deep down, she recognized the escalation for what it was, a warning of something darker taking form. Mark's thoughts had grown colder, sharper, and more deliberate. His obsession had transformed into a mission, one that justified every act of intrusion. In his mind, Evelyn was not simply a lover. She was his possession, someone who had promised him a life beyond the ordinary. Her attempts to withdraw from him were not acts of fear or regret but betrayals that demanded retribution. He convinced himself that she was bound to him by more than passion. She was bound by fate, and fate could not be denied. The resentment he carried toward Thomas became the fuel for his next phase of obsession. He began to view Thomas not as Evelyn's husband but as an interloper, someone standing in the way of what should rightfully be his. The more he dwelled on this, the more his hatred grew. He started following Thomas's routines, watching him leave for work, timing his arrivals home, mapping the hours when he was absent. To Mark, these observations were not just acts of curiosity, they were preparations. He was studying the life of the man he saw as an obstacle, collecting details that might one day serve a darker purpose. Evelyn's anxiety deepened as her attempts to push Mark away only seemed to strengthen his grip. She avoided his messages, ignored his presence, and limited her movements in an effort to regain a sense of safety. But every choice she made only confirmed to Mark that she was slipping away, and each confirmation drove him further into the belief that drastic action was necessary. The cycle of fear and obsession tightened like a noose, pulling them both closer to the inevitable confrontation neither could avoid. The duality of Evelyn's existence became unbearable. By day, she played the role of the devoted wife, tending to her home, attending community events, and smiling politely at neighbors. By night, she lay awake, haunted by the knowledge that Mark was somewhere nearby, watching, waiting, plotting. Her exhaustion grew, her nerves frayed, and her ability to maintain the facade of normalcy began to erode. Small cracks appeared in her behavior, moments of distraction, bursts of irritability, that threatened to expose the truth she had fought so hard to conceal. Mark, meanwhile, was descending further into isolation. His obsession with Evelyn consumed him, leaving little room for anything else. Friends noticed his withdrawal, his parents worried about his erratic moods, but he brushed off their concerns with excuses. He no longer cared about their perceptions. His entire world revolved around Evelyn and the life he believed they were destined to share. The more he retreated from reality, the more he constructed a fantasy where he and Evelyn stood together, unchallenged, after eliminating the man who stood between them. This fantasy, repeated and reinforced in his mind, began to feel less like imagination and more like a plan. He envisioned scenarios where Thomas was no longer part of the picture, where Evelyn would have no choice but to turn fully toward him. He told himself that she loved him, that her fear was temporary, that once freed from her obligation she would embrace him completely. The logic was twisted, but within Mark's fractured perspective it felt undeniable. Evelyn's fear reached its peak when she realized that Mark was no longer satisfied with their stolen past. He wanted permanence, and he was willing to dismantle her life to achieve it. She knew she should act, confess to Thomas, seek help, confront the truth of what she had created, but she remained paralyzed by shame and denial. Admitting the affair would destroy her reputation and marriage, and admitting the danger would mean exposing the choices that had led her there. So she remained silent, hoping in vain that the storm would pass on its own. But storms do not dissipate when left unchecked. They build until they break. Mark's fantasies of eliminating Thomas grew darker and more detailed. He thought of the house not as Evelyn's safe space but as a fortress keeping her from him. He considered the times when Thomas was alone, the vulnerabilities in his routines, the moments when opportunity might present itself. These were not fleeting thoughts. They were rehearsals, mental exercises in the pursuit of a goal that now felt inevitable to him. In the quiet of the neighborhood, no one suspected the scale of the danger unfolding. Children played on sidewalks, families gathered for dinners, and life carried on as though everything was normal. Yet beneath that facade, Evelyn was suffocating under the weight of her secret, and Mark was sharpening his obsession into intent. The balance between concealment and exposure, between fear and violence, had tilted beyond recovery. The relationship had long ceased to be an affair. It was no longer about desire, no longer about rebellion. It had become a deadly entanglement, a struggle between control and possession, fear and obsession, life and death. Evelyn's silence and Mark's fixation were hurtling toward collision, and once they met, the results would be irreversible. By the close of that season, one truth was clear. The path they were on no longer led to secrecy. It led to tragedy. The aftermath of Laura's murder no longer remained confined to a single neighborhood, or even the small town where it had occurred. By the time weeks had passed, the crime had become the centerpiece of a regional obsession, then a national headline. Every twist in the case seemed to carry a gravity that drew in more spectators. Newspapers framed it as a tragedy of love gone wrong, a story of lust and betrayal that turned to blood. Television anchors repeated the details of her affair with Jason, amplifying the scandal for audiences that could not look away. In living rooms across the country, people argued over who was most to blame, some laying guilt squarely at Jason's feet, others accusing Michael of neglect that drove his wife into the arms of a younger man. Each speculation, each new rumor, layered the case with more intensity. Investigators, however, tried to filter out the noise. They had been meticulously dissecting Laura's final days, reconstructing every hour leading up to her death. Phone records revealed countless calls and texts between her and Jason, many of them erased from her device but recovered through forensic tools. The messages painted a vivid picture of passion, longing, and increasingly desperate exchanges as Laura attempted to balance the thrill of her affair with the crushing fear of discovery. Jason's tone shifted over time from playful to insistent, as though his patience was thinning with the constraints Laura placed on their relationship. That impatience became a cornerstone of the prosecution's theory, that Jason's frustration reached a breaking point, culminating in murder. But theories required more than patterns of communication. The physical evidence remained a battlefield of interpretation. Jason's fingerprints inside Laura's home were indisputable, though the defense prepared to argue that his presence was consensual and in line with their ongoing relationship. A partial footprint discovered near the back entrance matched Jason's shoe size, but its clarity was questionable. Prosecutors emphasized the match while the defense dismissed it as inconclusive. Blood traces, though minute, had been found on Jason's hoodie seized during a search of his apartment. Forensic analysts swore under oath that the blood belonged to Laura, but the defense team probed every possible weakness in the testing procedures, suggesting cross-contamination. The battle over evidence grew as much about perception as about science, with each side angling for the jury's trust. Meanwhile, the community itself seemed divided by invisible fault lines. Some residents had known Jason since childhood and resisted the image of him as a killer. Others found the idea almost too easy to accept, labeling him as the reckless younger man who had destroyed a family and ended a life. Michael, the grieving husband, became a symbol of sorrow in the public eye. He was often described in articles as the stoic widower, carrying the weight of betrayal and murder simultaneously. Behind closed doors, his grief was far less contained. Friends later described him as a man unraveling in silence, unable to reconcile the dual truths that his wife had both loved another man and died violently in his absence. His cooperation with law enforcement was steady, but privately he oscillated between guilt, rage, and profound loss. Jason himself, once a familiar face in the neighborhood, became a figure of infamy. His mugshot circulated across every major news outlet, the flat, expressionless stare interpreted by many as coldness, by others as the look of a frightened young man overwhelmed by circumstances. While in custody, he maintained a stubborn quiet. He did not confess, Nor did he express sorrow for Laura's death in the ways the public seemed to crave. This silence fueled speculation that he felt no remorse. The prosecution spun it into evidence of a calculating killer. The defense insisted it was merely the posture of a man following his lawyer's advice. Court proceedings loomed like a storm cloud over the case, but the pretrial phase itself became its own spectacle. Hearings to determine the admissibility of evidence, bail considerations, and procedural disputes were broadcast in real time through countless media outlets. Every minor ruling became a headline. Legal analysts debated the strength of the prosecution's case on morning talk shows, while podcasts dissected the affair and speculated on Laura's state of mind. The narrative stretched beyond crime into morality, fidelity, and the dangerous allure of forbidden relationships. For many, Laura was no longer simply a woman who had been murdered. She had become a cautionary tale. Even as the legal battle escalated, law enforcement remained cautious about the foundation of their case. The reliance on circumstantial evidence carried risk. Investigators knew juries could be unpredictable, swayed by charisma, or the absence of certainty. The prosecution sought to bolster its case by reconstructing the night of the murder minute by minute. They tracked Jason's movements through cell tower data, placing him in proximity to Laura's home. They highlighted the lack of forced entry, implying that Laura had let her killer inside willingly, which only pointed back to Jason. The defense prepared counterarguments, noting that others might have known how to access the home, that assumptions about Laura's behavior could not be treated as proof. As the months passed, the pressure weighed heavily on Jason's family. His parents, once respected in the community, now endured whispers and open hostility. His mother was spotted crying during a pre-trial hearing, clutching a worn Bible in her hands. Neighbors avoided eye contact or worse, hurled accusations under their breath. The family's attempts to present Jason as a decent young man were drowned out by the tidal wave of public outrage. It was not only Jason on trial in the court of opinion. It was his entire family, their history, their character, their worth. For Laura's relatives, the pain transformed into a mission. Her sister, in particular, became a vocal presence in media interviews. She demanded justice, framing Jason as a predator who had exploited Laura's vulnerabilities. She spoke of Laura not as the unfaithful wife headlines painted her to be, but as a woman who had been lonely, searching for connection, and ultimately trapped in a dangerous relationship. Her words struck chords with audiences who wanted to remember Laura as more than a victim of scandal. Yet beneath the sympathy lay an unavoidable question. Had Laura herself underestimated the peril of her choices, or had she simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time when Jason's temper flared? By the time jury selection approached, the story had become a cultural phenomenon. It was no longer just about Laura, Jason, or Michael. It was about desire, betrayal, violence, and the fragile line between passion and destruction. Books were proposed, documentaries pitched, each promising to uncover the real truth behind the tragedy. The saturation of coverage created a paradox. The closer the trial loomed, the more difficult it became to separate fact from narrative, evidence from sensationalism. What had begun as a shocking neighborhood scandal was now a stage for the entire nation. And yet, beneath the spectacle, the essential tragedy remained. A life ended brutally, a family shattered, and a young man accused of murder. The trial promised answers, but it also promised more pain, more exposure, more unraveling of secrets that perhaps none of the families involved wanted aired in public. For all the theories, speculation, and public fascination, one truth lingered unshaken. Someone had killed Laura, and the fight to prove who would consume the months ahead. The courthouse lights would soon blaze, cameras would roll, and 12 jurors would be asked to decide whether Jason was guilty of love turned lethal, or whether the story the prosecution had so carefully built was merely another layer of fiction. As the doors opened on the trial, the weight of judgment shifted from whispers in neighborhoods to the solemn authority of the courtroom. And with that shift, the case entered its most unforgiving stage. The first day of the trial arrived with a gravity that seemed to pull the entire community into its orbit. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse before dawn, drawn by morbid curiosity, by the hunger for resolution, or by the spectacle of a crime that had outgrown its small-town roots. Reporters lined the steps, their microphones catching every whispered opinion, every rumor, every flicker of emotion from the families on either side. Inside the courtroom, tension coiled like a living thing. 12 jurors took their seats, ordinary men and women suddenly tasked with the extraordinary burden of weighing guilt against innocence in a case saturated with scandal. The prosecution began with precision, framing the case as a narrative of obsession, betrayal, and rage. They presented Laura as a woman trapped between two worlds, the domestic stability of her marriage and the reckless passion of her affair. Jason, they argued, embodied temptation that soured into danger, his youthful energy masking an undercurrent of possessiveness and volatility. They described him as unable to accept rejection, unwilling to tolerate Laura's hesitation about leaving her husband, and ultimately driven to a violent conclusion. This framing was not merely about evidence but about crafting a story that jurors could carry with them into deliberation, a story that resonated with their fears about desire turning deadly. The defense countered by dismantling this narrative piece by piece. They emphasized the lack of direct evidence linking Jason to the murder. Yes, he had been involved with Laura, and yes, his presence at her home was documented, but affairs did not equate to homicide. They warned jurors against the temptation to let morality cloud reason, insisting that Laura's choices, while scandalous, did not prove Jason's guilt. They introduced the idea of alternative explanations, shadows of possibility in which someone else might have entered Laura's life, or harbored a motive unknown to investigators. The defense strategy hinged on planting doubt, and even the smallest seeds of uncertainty could sprout into acquittal. As testimony unfolded, the trial transformed into a slow excavation of Laura's private life. Friends and neighbors were called to the stand, some reluctantly, others eager to unburden themselves of secrets. They spoke of late-night whispers, of seeing Jason's car parked near Laura's house, of noticing changes in her demeanor during the months before her death. Some described her as radiant and alive, as though the affair had awakened something long dormant. Others noted her nervousness, her distracted glances, the sense that she lived with one eye over her shoulder. These testimonies, while circumstantial, wove a tapestry of tension, suggesting a woman both exhilarated and terrified by the double life she led. The forensic evidence became the trial's centerpiece. Experts took the stand to explain blood traces on Jason's clothing, shoe impressions near the back door, and the cellular data placing him near Laura's home on the night she died. Their words were technical, laden with jargon, yet the weight they carried was immense. Each chart, each scientific explanation was intended to remove ambiguity, to replace speculation with certainty. Yet the defense seized every opportunity to challenge methodology, highlighting the limitations of DNA testing, the unreliability of partial footprints, and the potential for innocent explanations. To the jurors, the clash of experts became less about absolute truth and more about credibility, whose voice seemed steadier, whose reasoning seemed less flawed. Michael, the grieving husband, emerged as one of the most poignant witnesses. His testimony was delivered with quiet devastation, painting a picture of a man blindsided by betrayal and loss. He spoke not only of discovering his wife's death but of the subtle signs he had overlooked in the weeks leading up to it, her absences, her evasions, the sense that she was slipping away from him. His grief was raw, his pain unfiltered, and it left the courtroom heavy with silence. Yet his presence also raised questions that lingered beneath the surface. Could his resentment, his humiliation, have been motive enough for someone else to act? The defense did not directly accuse him, but their line of questioning suggested the possibility of overlooked suspects, an implication designed to fracture certainty. Jason's family sat stoically through the proceedings, their faces pale with strain. His mother often clutched tissues, her quiet sobs a counterpoint to the prosecution's portrait of her son as a murderer. His father sat rigid, jaw tight, as though holding the weight of shame and anger in equal measure. For them, the courtroom was not merely a legal arena but a public crucifixion, each accusation against Jason resonating as an indictment of their own lives, their parenting, their place in the community. When Jason's turn came to sit before the court, his silence was deafening. He did not testify, a decision made by his legal team, but his presence loomed large. Jurors watched his expressions closely, interpreting every flicker of his eyes, every shift in his posture. To some he appeared cold, detached, unfeeling. To others he seemed overwhelmed, a young man swallowed whole by the machinery of the justice system. His choice not to speak left a void that the prosecution was quick to fill with their narrative of guilt. Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy reached a fever pitch. News anchors dissected each witness statement, each piece of evidence, while commentators debated the moral dimensions of the case. Laura was portrayed alternately as a tragic figure, a reckless adulteress, a victim of her own desires. Jason was painted as both a heartless predator and a scapegoat for societal outrage. The trial transcended the individuals involved, becoming a mirror for cultural anxieties about marriage, fidelity, and the destructive potential of desire. As the prosecution neared the conclusion of its case, they built toward a crescendo, weaving the evidence into a singular, devastating narrative. Jason had motive, opportunity, and presence at the crime scene. He had been rejected, and in his fury, he had taken Laura's life. They urged jurors to see the threads not as coincidence but as inevitability. They framed the murder as the natural conclusion of a dangerous affair spiraling out of control. Their closing words left the courtroom in heavy silence, the weight of accusation pressing down on everyone present. The defense, preparing to present its case, knew that their task was monumental. The tide of public opinion was against them, the prosecution's story tightly woven. Yet they had one advantage. The burden of proof did not rest on them. They did not need to prove Jason's innocence. They only needed to dismantle certainty, to show that gaps and doubts remained. Their strategy would lean heavily on undermining the prosecution's case, highlighting every inconsistency, every missing link, every possibility that the truth was more complicated than the state wanted jurors to believe. As the first phase of the trial drew to a close, the air inside the courtroom seemed charged with anticipation. The jurors had been inundated with details, emotions, and arguments, yet the hardest work still lay ahead. The defense would soon reveal its hand, and with it, the possibility of shifting the narrative that had thus far dominated the proceedings. Outside, the crowd thickened, cameras flashed, and the world waited for the next chapter in a story that had already become a national obsession. The trial was no longer about just one night of violence but about the fragile balance of love, betrayal, and rage, and the thin line that separates passion from tragedy. In the days ahead, the defense would attempt to redraw that line, to recast Jason not as a murderer but as a victim of circumstance and perception. Whether they succeeded or failed would determine not only Jason's fate, but the legacy of Laura's death itself. The defense began its presentation with calculated restraint, knowing that the prosecution had already drawn the jurors deep into an emotional narrative of betrayal and murder. Their opening witnesses were chosen not for drama, but for the subtle cracks they might carve into the seemingly solid wall of the state's case. A former forensic technician was brought to question the reliability of DNA collection procedures, particularly the trace blood samples lifted from Jason's hoodie. With calm authority, the witness explained how even the smallest contamination, an ungloved hand, a reused instrument, could compromise results. Though he stopped short of alleging misconduct, the implication was unmistakable. The blood evidence might not be as airtight as the prosecution claimed. The defense followed with a data specialist who scrutinized the cell tower records used to place Jason near Laura's home on the night of the murder. With diagrams and technical detail, the specialist explained that cell tower triangulation was not precise, that a single tower could cover a wide radius, and that Jason's location could not be pinpointed with absolute certainty. The testimony chipped away at one of the prosecution's most persuasive points, planting the possibility that Jason could have been elsewhere within the range. To the defense, uncertainty was their ally, and they leaned heavily on the principle that doubt, once introduced, could not be erased. Next came character witnesses, neighbors and acquaintances willing to speak of Jason in gentler terms. They described him as quiet, sometimes withdrawn, a young man still finding his path in life. None claimed to know the intimate details of his relationship with Laura, but they resisted the portrait of him as violent or unstable. Some even testified to his helpfulness around the neighborhood, recounting times he had mowed lawns for the elderly or fixed minor repairs without expecting payment. While such testimonies could not negate the physical evidence, they served to remind jurors that Jason was more than the shadow cast by the prosecution. But the defense's boldest move came in the form of redirecting suspicion. They did not outright accuse Michael, Laura's husband, of the crime, but they leaned heavily into his potential motives. Through careful questioning, they highlighted the strain in Laura and Michael's marriage, the signs of growing distance, and the humiliation Michael would have endured upon discovering the affair. Financial records were introduced, suggesting that divorce could have placed Michael under severe strain. The defense emphasized that in crimes of passion, husbands were often the first suspects, subtly reframing the jury's perception without making direct accusations. This tactic struck a nerve. Michael had already endured the torment of testifying for the prosecution, laying bare his grief and humiliation. Now he was forced to sit silently while defense attorneys dissected his life, painting him as a man with motive and opportunity. His discomfort was palpable, and the jury could not ignore the tension radiating from his presence. For the defense, this discomfort was intentional, designed to complicate what had once seemed a straightforward case. As the defense continued, they introduced testimony about Laura herself, not to vilify her but to humanize her complexity. Friends spoke of her struggles with loneliness, her sense of being trapped in a marriage that no longer fulfilled her, and her search for validation in the arms of someone younger. While these testimonies risked alienating the jury by exposing Laura's flaws, they also reframed her as a woman navigating emotional turbulence, rather than a passive victim. By painting her as complex, the defense indirectly weakened the prosecution's portrayal of Jason as the singular villain in her story. Expert witnesses also cast doubt on the timeline of the murder. A pathologist suggested that the estimated time of death, while consistent with Jason's alleged presence, could not be pinned down with the certainty the prosecution implied. Variations in body temperature, environmental factors, and other conditions could shift the timeline by hours. This uncertainty opened the door to the possibility that someone else could have been with Laura in the crucial window. The defense's crescendo came with their closing arguments. They wove together every thread of doubt they had introduced: unreliable forensic methods, ambiguous cell data, alternative motives, and the complexity of Laura's relationships. They urged jurors to resist the temptation of a simple story, to recognize that human lives rarely fit neatly into narratives of passion and violence. They reminded the jury that the burden of proof lay with the state, and that unless guilt could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, Jason must be acquitted. Throughout this phase, Jason remained silent, his demeanor consistent with the strategy his attorneys had chosen. His lack of testimony frustrated some observers, who longed for a direct statement of innocence, but the defense calculated that any misstep under cross-examination could undo their work. Instead, Jason became a vessel for interpretation. Was he a cold, calculating killer refusing to speak, or a cautious young man trusting the system to protect him? The ambiguity became another layer of doubt, one the defense hoped jurors would interpret in their favor. The trial had now stretched into weeks, each day a slow unspooling of arguments, evidence, and counterarguments. Jurors had been instructed not to discuss the case outside deliberations, but the weight of it hung over them like a shadow. They sat stone-faced in the courtroom, absorbing every word, every exhibit, every tear shed by the families. They knew that soon, their task would no longer be to listen but to decide, and the responsibility pressed on them with relentless force. Outside, the media circus continued unabated. Public opinion seemed to fracture further with every revelation. Some commentators praised the defense for exposing weaknesses in the state's case, while others condemned their attempts to redirect suspicion toward Michael as cruel and manipulative. The narrative shifted daily, with headlines trumpeting doubt one moment and certainty the next. The public's hunger for resolution remained unsated, and every delay in the proceedings only deepened the obsession. By the time both sides rested their cases, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had become almost unbearable. The prosecution believed they had built an unshakable narrative of guilt, while the defense trusted they had seeded enough uncertainty to sway at least one juror. Closing statements loomed, promising to crystallize weeks of testimony into final appeals for justice or mercy. The jurors, weary yet alert, knew the end was near. They had listened to stories of love and betrayal, examined bloodstains and digital records, and watched families unravel in front of them. Now they would be asked to decide whether Jason's fate was to be sealed by conviction or spared by doubt. And as the judge prepared to instruct them on the law, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence, the kind that only comes before decisions that will echo for lifetimes. The trial had laid bare every secret, every sin, every possibility, but the truth, the one truth about Laura's death, still hung elusive in the air, waiting to be claimed. The courtroom shifted into a different rhythm as the closing arguments began, the long weeks of testimony distilled into competing narratives. The prosecution moved first, delivering their summation with the gravity of finality. They reminded jurors of the intimate connection between Jason and Laura, a bond that had moved beyond secrecy into danger. They recounted the text messages that revealed his growing impatience, his unwillingness to remain hidden in the shadows of her marriage. They drew attention to the blood evidence, the shoe print, the cell tower data, each piece a strand in a net they insisted could not be ignored. Their words pulsed with emotion, their tone both mournful and accusatory, as though Laura's absence itself demanded conviction. They asked the jury to picture the final moments of her life, to imagine her fear as passion turned violent, and to see in Jason not a misunderstood young man but the very author of her destruction. The defense responded with deliberate calm, appealing not to emotion but to reason. They reminded the jurors that suspicion was not proof, that proximity was not guilt, and that the law demanded certainty where only conjecture had been offered. They emphasized the flaws in forensic collection, the imprecision of cell tower data, and the possibility of alternative suspects. They cautioned the jury against being seduced by the prosecution's narrative, arguing that it was easier to craft a story of betrayal and rage than to meet the burden of proof required for conviction. They urged the jurors to resist the tide of public opinion pressing from outside the courthouse, and to honor the principle that it was better to let a guilty man go free than to condemn an innocent one on shaky grounds. Their closing words carried a sharp edge, reminding the jury that doubt, once seen, could not be unseen. The judge's instructions followed, dense with legal language yet critical in shaping the jurors' deliberations. He explained the meaning of reasonable doubt, outlined the charges, and cautioned them not to let sympathy or prejudice guide their decision. The courtroom listened in silence, though everyone knew the true weight of those words would only be felt behind closed doors, in the sequestered room where 12 ordinary people would decide a man's fate. When deliberations began, the jury filed into the room burdened by weeks of testimony and the heavy silence of expectation. The first hours were tentative, filled with the mechanical work of organizing evidence and recounting testimony. Some jurors spoke quickly, declaring their certainty that Jason was guilty. Others hesitated, voicing concerns about the gaps in the timeline, the reliability of the evidence, the possibility of Michael's suppressed role in the affair's collapse. The divide was clear from the start, not of hostility but of perspective. Some believed the state had drawn a convincing picture, while others saw only fragments. The hours stretched into days. Charts were re-examined, expert testimony reread, and timelines debated. The blood evidence became the crux of many arguments. Was it undeniable proof of Jason's presence during Laura's final moments, or could it have been the result of contamination or an earlier visit? The cell tower data was dissected repeatedly. Some jurors convinced it placed Jason near the scene, others wary of its admitted imprecision. The defense's emphasis on doubt found fertile ground, not enough to sway the majority, but enough to keep unity out of reach. Tension within the jury room grew. Some jurors felt the weight of Laura's family's grief pressing upon them, the image of Michael's devastated testimony haunting their thoughts. Others clung stubbornly to the principle of doubt, unwilling to gamble with a man's life in the absence of absolute certainty. The debates grew sharper, voices louder, the atmosphere heavy with exhaustion. Yet each night, when they returned to their hotel rooms, they carried the same questions with them, unresolved and relentless. Outside the courthouse, the world waited impatiently. Reporters filled the airwaves with speculation about how long deliberations might last, experts dissecting the possible meanings of the delay. Supporters of Jason's innocence clung to hope, while others saw the extended deliberation as evidence of guilt overwhelming resistance. Public opinion fractured further, the case becoming less about facts and more about allegiances to competing interpretations of justice. Back in the jury room, exhaustion began to erode patience. Some jurors grew frustrated, urging their peers to stop overanalyzing and make a decision. Others dug in deeper, determined not to be bullied into a verdict they could not support. The discussions became cyclical, the same points rehashed with no new ground gained. The foreperson tried to maintain order, but the growing weariness made every small disagreement feel monumental. On the fourth day, a shift began. A juror who had previously leaned toward acquittal admitted to wavering, unsettled by the cumulative weight of the evidence. Another followed, citing the blood traces as too significant to ignore. The momentum tilted slowly toward conviction but not unanimously. One juror in particular remained steadfast, repeating again and again that the defense had shown enough doubt to prevent certainty. Their persistence became a barrier the others could not overcome, preventing consensus even as pressure mounted. The judge received word of the stalemate, but he instructed the jury to continue, reminding them of their duty to exhaust every effort before declaring themselves deadlocked. The jurors returned to their discussions, some weary to the point of despair, others determined to hold their ground. By the sixth day, the room had fractured into camps of frustration and resolve, each side convinced of the righteousness of their position. Finally, on the seventh day, the jury sent word that they could not reach a unanimous verdict. The announcement sent ripples through the courtroom. Laura's family sat stricken, their hopes for resolution shattered once again. Jason's family wept openly, relief mingling with exhaustion, the reprieve bittersweet and temporary. The judge declared a mistrial, his voice heavy with the acknowledgement that the case remained unresolved. The mistrial set the stage for renewed conflict. Prosecutors vowed to retry Jason, insisting that justice for Laura demanded nothing less. The defense declared victory in the face of overwhelming odds, emphasizing that the jury's inability to convict underscored the weakness of the state's case. For the public, the mistrial only deepened fascination. Headlines framed it as a failure of the system, a story without an ending, a wound left open. For Jason, the mistrial meant continued limbo. He would not walk free, but neither would he face immediate sentencing. For Michael, it was another cruel twist in a journey already marked by loss and betrayal. For Laura, it meant her story remained suspended, her death unresolved, her memory contested in the battle between guilt and doubt. The trial's conclusion without conclusion left everyone unsatisfied, yet it also ensured that the story would continue. The hunger for resolution, for truth, for justice remained unfulfilled. And as prosecutors prepared to regroup, and the defense readied itself for another round, the case that had already consumed so many lives promised to cast its shadow for months, even years to come. The weeks following the forensic breakthrough proved to be a turning point in the case, though the shift was not immediate. The authorities had secured critical evidence linking Lisa to the crime, but proving intent, premeditation, and the sequence of events that led to Daniel's death was still an arduous process. Forensic investigators compiled detailed reports that outlined the timeline of the murder, the disposal of the body, and the measures Lisa had taken to conceal the crime. Each new discovery revealed a level of calculation that surprised even the most seasoned detectives. The crime was not impulsive, nor was it born of a single heated argument. It bore the hallmarks of planning, desperation, and an obsessive attempt to maintain control of her situation. As investigators pieced together their findings, a picture began to emerge of Lisa's psychological state in the weeks leading up to the murder. Neighbors recalled subtle changes in her demeanor. She had grown more withdrawn, her interactions with other women in the neighborhood had become tense, and her once bright and open smile had been replaced with a guarded stiffness. Behind closed doors, her life had descended into chaos. The affair with Daniel had begun as an escape, a reckless thrill, but soon it had become a burden. Daniel's presence in her life was no longer just a secret indulgence. It was a liability. He had grown clingy, increasingly demanding, and at times openly possessive. Lisa, terrified of discovery, viewed him not as a lover but as a threat to the life she had carefully constructed. The prosecution used this mounting stress as a cornerstone of their case. They argued that Lisa's motivations were clear. Daniel's continued presence endangered her marriage, her social standing, and even her financial stability. Killing him was, in her fractured reasoning, the only way to restore balance. The discovery of messages on Daniel's phone only bolstered this narrative. He had threatened to tell her husband if she didn't leave her marriage. His words, desperate and insistent, painted a picture of a young man who believed he was being strung along. For Lisa, these words were not just a threat. They were the trigger that set everything in motion. Meanwhile, forensic teams delved deeper into the physical evidence. The garage, once a mundane part of Lisa's suburban home, became a focal point. Luminal testing revealed traces of blood that had been carefully scrubbed but not completely eradicated. Fibers from the carpet in Lisa's car matched fibers found on Daniel's clothing, suggesting his body had been transported in her vehicle. Small scratches on her hands and arms, initially dismissed by her as gardening injuries, were consistent with defensive wounds inflicted during a struggle. These details, minor on their own, became overwhelming when presented together. The prosecution also focused heavily on the inconsistencies in Lisa's alibi. She had claimed to be shopping at the time of Daniel's disappearance, but security footage showed her car leaving her home at odd hours on the night in question. She had used cash instead of cards, seemingly in an attempt to avoid creating a paper trail. When these inconsistencies were presented to her in interrogation, her explanations were evasive, often changing slightly each time she was asked. The cumulative effect painted her as deceptive and calculating. Public fascination with the case only deepened as more details surfaced. Media outlets seized on the scandalous elements: the affair between a housewife and her neighbor's son, the gruesome disposal of the body, and the betrayal of trust in a seemingly idyllic community. The courtroom was packed with journalists, sketch artists, and curious citizens who wanted to witness the unraveling of a suburban tragedy. Headlines painted Lisa as a femme fatale, a woman who had seduced and then destroyed a younger man to protect her secrets, while the defense attempted to humanize her, portraying her as a victim of circumstance who had acted out of fear. The narrative of a manipulative killer was far more compelling to the public. The defense's strategy relied heavily on undermining the prosecution's claims of premeditation. They argued that Lisa had not planned the killing but had acted in a moment of panic. Daniel, they suggested, had become aggressive, and in the heat of the confrontation, things had spiraled out of control. This narrative was designed to reduce the charge from murder to manslaughter, potentially sparing Lisa the harshest penalties. To support this theory, they pointed to Daniel's own history of impulsive behavior, painting him as unstable and emotionally volatile. But the forensic evidence presented a significant hurdle. The cleaning supplies found in Lisa's home, purchased shortly before Daniel's death, undermined claims of spontaneity. The precise manner in which the body had been concealed suggested careful thought rather than panic. Even the decision to use cash instead of cards for her purchases revealed an attempt to cover her tracks. Each of these choices pointed to planning, not accident. As the trial loomed, the prosecution began to build their narrative around the concept of control. Lisa had controlled her outward image for years, projecting the perfect suburban wife. She had controlled her secret life with Daniel, compartmentalizing it from her family and community. When Daniel threatened to disrupt that control, she resorted to the most extreme measure possible. It was not passion, they argued, but calculation that had driven her. The defense, recognizing the uphill battle, sought to humanize Lisa by focusing on her emotional turmoil. They brought in psychological experts to testify about the immense stress she had been under, the fear of losing her family, and the breakdown of rational thought in moments of acute panic. They attempted to portray her not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a woman pushed to the edge, making a terrible decision in a moment of desperation. In the midst of these legal battles, the community itself was left to wrestle with the reality of what had happened. Neighbors who had once shared barbecues and exchanged holiday gifts now found themselves avoiding eye contact, whispering behind closed doors. The realization that such a horrific crime had unfolded in their midst was deeply unsettling. Some expressed anger at Lisa for shattering the trust of their close-knit community, while others pitted her, seeing her as a woman trapped in a web of her own making. The trial date drew closer, and with it came mounting anticipation. Every new detail leaked to the press fueled speculation about the outcome. Would Lisa be convicted of premeditated murder and face a life sentence, or would the defense succeed in reducing the charge, allowing her the possibility of eventual freedom? The stakes were high, and the weight of the evidence hung heavily over the proceedings. As the chapter of investigation closed and the courtroom drama prepared to unfold, the case had transformed from a neighborhood scandal into a spectacle that gripped the wider public. Lisa, once a quiet housewife living in the comfort of suburban anonymity, was now a figure of national intrigue, her every action dissected and scrutinized. The looming trial promised answers, but it also threatened to expose even darker truths about the lengths people will go to preserve the lives they build on lies. And as the final pre-trial hearings wrapped, The stage was set for the battle to come. The evidence was ready, the lawyers prepared, and the public eager for resolution. The murder of Daniel had left deep scars, and the trial would determine whether Lisa would face the ultimate consequence for her actions, or if she would manage even now to manipulate the narrative in her favor. The next chapter would open not in living rooms or quiet suburban streets, but in the unforgiving glare of the courtroom, where every detail of Lisa's double life would be laid bare. The trial began under the weight of intense scrutiny. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, their cameras flashing as they captured every detail of Lisa's arrival. She appeared subdued, dressed in muted colors, her expression carefully composed. But beneath her outward calm, the reality of what she faced was unmistakable. The trial was not just about her actions on the night Daniel died. It was about her entire life unraveling before the public eye. Every secret, every deception, every choice she had made was now evidence to be dissected and debated. The prosecution opened with a methodical presentation of their case, laying out a timeline of events that painted Lisa as a calculating killer. They walked the jury through her affair with Daniel, emphasizing the imbalance in their relationship. A married woman with power and influence over a younger, impressionable man. The prosecutors argued that Lisa had grown increasingly fearful of Daniel's demands, especially his threats to reveal their affair, and that this fear had driven her to commit murder. The jury was shown receipts of cleaning supplies purchased shortly before Daniel's death, surveillance footage capturing Lisa's car leaving her home at suspicious hours, and forensic photographs from the garage and vehicle that revealed traces of blood and fibers linking her to the crime. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, weaving a narrative that suggested not spontaneity, but deliberate planning. Experts were brought in to testify about the chemical traces found on Lisa's property, the blood spatter patterns that indicated an attempt at cleaning, and the bruising on Daniel's body that suggested he had struggled in his final moments. The prosecution emphasized these details relentlessly, portraying Lisa as someone who had weighed her options and chosen murder as the most effective solution to silence Daniel forever. The defense countered with their own narrative, one designed to appeal not to logic but to emotion. They painted Lisa as a woman under immense pressure, caught between the expectations of her family, the fear of social ruin, and the manipulative grip of a younger lover who had become increasingly erratic. Psychological experts testified about the effects of chronic stress, describing how prolonged anxiety could impair rational thinking and push individuals toward desperate decisions. They acknowledged Lisa's actions but argued that they had not been calculated in advance. Instead, they were the tragic result of panic and fear. To reinforce this argument, the defense highlighted Daniel's text messages, which contained threats and emotional pleas. They suggested that Daniel had cornered Lisa, leaving her feeling trapped and without options. By framing the killing as the outcome of escalating emotional turmoil, they hoped to shift the jury's perception away from premeditation and toward a lesser charge of manslaughter. As the trial progressed, the courtroom became a stage where every detail of Lisa's double life was laid bare. The prosecution dissected her affair, portraying her as manipulative and self-serving, while the defense emphasized her vulnerability and humanity. Photographs of Lisa with her husband and children were juxtaposed with evidence of her secret relationship with Daniel, creating a stark contrast that underscored the duplicity of her existence. The media amplified these contrasts, turning Lisa into a symbol of betrayal and deceit. Headlines branded her as a suburban seductress, a woman who had destroyed not only a young man's life, but also the stability of her family and community. Every expression she made in court was analyzed, every detail of her wardrobe critiqued. For many observers, she had already been convicted in the court of public opinion long before the jury reached a decision. Witness testimonies added another layer of complexity to the proceedings. Neighbors recalled seeing Daniel at Lisa's home frequently, sometimes late at night, fueling the narrative of a hidden relationship. Others described noticing changes in Lisa's demeanor in the months leading up to the murder. Her withdrawn behavior, her evasiveness, her nervousness during casual conversations. These accounts provided context that reinforced the prosecution's claims of a woman unraveling under the weight of her secret. But not all testimonies worked in favor of the prosecution. Friends of Lisa spoke of her devotion to her children, her reputation as a supportive neighbor, and her role in community activities. They painted a picture of someone who had been generous and caring, not a cold-blooded murderer. The defense leaned heavily on these accounts, attempting to sway the jury by emphasizing that Lisa was not defined solely by her worst actions. Despite these efforts, the forensic evidence loomed large. The jury listened intently as experts described the traces of blood found in Lisa's garage and vehicle, the careful cleaning that had failed to erase every sign of the crime, and the fibers that tied Daniel's body to her home. These details were difficult to dismiss, and they underscored the prosecution's narrative of deliberate concealment. The tension in the courtroom grew with each passing day. Spectators whispered among themselves as new revelations came to light, while journalists hurried to file stories that would capture the day's most dramatic moments. Lisa sat quietly through it all, her eyes often cast downward, her hands clasped tightly together. Some interpreted her silence as guilt, while others saw it as the posture of a woman overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. The judge maintained order with a firm hand, ensuring that the trial proceeded with fairness despite the media frenzy. The jury, composed of men and women from diverse backgrounds, listened carefully, their expressions inscrutable. They knew the weight of the decision before them, aware that their verdict would not only determine Lisa's fate, but also serve as a reflection of justice in a case that had captivated the nation. By the time the prosecution rested its case, the narrative of Lisa as a calculating murderer was firmly established. The defense, however, still had opportunities to sway the jury. They brought Lisa's husband to the stand, where he testified about his shock and disbelief, his struggle to reconcile the woman he had married with the accusations against her. His testimony was emotional, portraying Lisa as a mother and wife first, someone whose entire life had been defined by her family. The defense hoped this portrayal would humanize her, softening the jury's perception and planting seeds of doubt about her capacity for premeditated violence. Yet even as the defense presented its arguments, the evidence weighed heavily. The meticulous steps Lisa had taken after Daniel's death were difficult to align with the image of a woman acting in blind panic. The jury would have to decide whether these actions were born of desperation or calculation, whether Lisa was a victim of her own circumstances or a manipulator who had chosen murder as a means of escape. As the trial neared its climax, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew charged with anticipation. Both sides had presented their strongest arguments, and the outcome now rested on the jury's interpretation of the facts and emotions laid before them. The community, still reeling from the betrayal and violence that had shattered their suburban peace, awaited closure. The media prepared for the final act of a story that had gripped the nation. And Lisa, sitting quietly at the defense table, faced the inevitable reckoning. The life she had once known was gone, replaced by a reality shaped by her choices and their consequences. The jury would soon decide whether she would spend the rest of her life behind bars, or whether some measure of mercy would be extended. The next phase would bring closing arguments, a last opportunity for both prosecution and defense to sway the jury. With so much at stake, every word would matter, every detail could tip the balance. The trial, which had exposed the darkest corners of Lisa's life, was building toward its decisive moment. The closing arguments began with the prosecution, and they wasted no time in weaving together the threads of evidence they had carefully laid out over the course of the trial. Their strategy was not to introduce new information, but to remind the jury of the meticulous case they had built. They spoke of motive, painting Lisa as a woman desperate to silence the young man who threatened her stability, her family, and her image in the community. They reminded the jury of the text messages that demonstrated Daniel's intention to expose their affair, framing them as the catalyst that pushed Lisa toward murder. From motive, they transitioned to means, walking through the physical evidence once more. They highlighted the blood traces discovered in the garage, the fibers that tied Daniel's body to Lisa's car, and the chemical residues that confirmed her efforts to clean the crime scene. Each of these elements, they argued, was not the byproduct of a frantic moment but of a calculated effort to erase the evidence of her crime. They asked the jury to consider how a panicked person could carry out such deliberate actions, from purchasing cleaning supplies in cash to scrubbing down the scene with precision. Panic, they claimed, explained nothing. Planning explained everything. Finally, they turned to opportunity. Lisa's inconsistent alibis, her suspicious movements on the night of the murder, and her failure to provide clear explanations all pointed to her guilt. They reminded the jury that lies are rarely told by the innocent, and that Lisa's repeated shifts in her story revealed her intent to deceive. With every word, the prosecution emphasized that this was not a tragedy born of passion, but a cold decision to eliminate a problem. Their final words were heavy with gravity. They told the jury that Daniel's life had been cut short not by accident or chance, but by a woman who valued her secrets more than his existence. They urged the jury to deliver justice not only for Daniel, but for a community betrayed by the darkness hidden within one of its own. When the prosecutor sat down, the weight of their argument lingered in the courtroom. The defense rose next, tasked with salvaging what little ground remained. Their strategy was to appeal to empathy, to remind the jury of Lisa's humanity in the face of damning evidence. They began by acknowledging the tragedy of Daniel's death, carefully avoiding denial of the facts. Instead, they framed the case as one of context. They argued that Lisa was a woman under immense pressure, juggling the expectations of a marriage, the responsibilities of motherhood, and the fear of exposure from a relationship she had come to regret. They reminded the jury of Daniel's text messages, which revealed not only his desperation, but his willingness to threaten Lisa's stability. They suggested that the final confrontation between the two had spiraled out of control, that Daniel's intensity had triggered panic in Lisa, and that the fatal outcome had not been the result of premeditation but of fear. They emphasized that her actions afterward, while misguided and desperate, were not evidence of calculation but of a person in shock trying to conceal a terrible mistake. The defense leaned heavily on character witnesses who had spoken to Lisa's devotion as a wife and mother. They urged the jury not to define her solely by her worst act but to see the totality of her life. They painted her as a woman who had lost her way, who had made poor decisions, but who was not the heartless killer the prosecution described. Their plea was not for acquittal but for mercy, for the jury to recognize the difference between a calculated murder and a tragic mistake. Their final words framed Lisa not as a villain but as a flawed human being, someone who had crumbled under the weight of circumstances. They asked the jury to see themselves in her, to imagine the fear, the desperation, the moment of panic that could push anyone to a point of no return. And with that, the defense rested, leaving the jury with a choice between two starkly different narratives. When the jury was dismissed to deliberate, the air in the courtroom remained thick with tension. Spectators whispered, reporters filed stories, and the families of both Lisa and Daniel sat in silence, awaiting the outcome that would define the rest of their lives. The deliberations were expected to be long, given the complexity of the case and the emotions it evoked. Inside the jury room, the 12 individuals carried the burden of interpreting, not only the facts but the emotions woven into the trial. They debated Lisa's intent, dissecting the evidence presented by both sides. Some jurors leaned toward the prosecution's argument, convinced that Lisa's actions bore all the hallmarks of premeditation. The cleaning supplies, the concealed body, the inconsistencies in her alibi. These details seemed impossible to reconcile with panic. Others hesitated, swayed by the defense's plea for mercy. They saw Lisa as a woman whose life had spiraled beyond her control, and they struggled with the idea of labeling her a cold-blooded murderer. They questioned whether the evidence truly proved premeditation beyond a reasonable doubt, or whether the defense had succeeded in planting the seeds of doubt they needed. The deliberations stretched on, hours turning into days. The media outside speculated endlessly, with experts debating the strength of the prosecution's case versus the emotional pull of the defense's arguments. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some saw Lisa as a manipulator who deserved the harshest penalty, while others sympathized with her, framing her as a woman who had made a catastrophic mistake. Back in the courtroom, the weight became unbearable. Lisa sat quietly, her composure carefully maintained, though those who observed her closely noticed the tension in her hands, the way her jaw tightened when the jury filed in and out. Daniel's family sat in grim silence, their grief still raw, their desire for justice unshaken. For them, no outcome could bring him back, but a conviction would at least affirm his life had value. On the third day of deliberations, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The announcement sent ripples through the courthouse, drawing crowds of spectators and reporters eager to hear the outcome. The families were summoned, the attorneys prepared, and the judge returned to the bench to preside over the final act of the trial. The jury filed in, their expressions grave, the weight of their decision evident on their faces. They had spent days wrestling with the evidence, the emotions, and the moral implications of their choice. Now their verdict would decide Lisa's fate. The courtroom held its breath as the foreperson prepared to deliver the words that would either condemn or spare her. The trial had revealed the darkest corners of Lisa's life, exposing her secrets and laying bare the consequences of her choices. Whatever the verdict, one truth was inescapable. The suburban facade that had once shielded her was gone forever. She was no longer just a housewife, no longer just a neighbor. She had become a figure defined by betrayal, by violence, and by the tragic entanglement of lives that should never have crossed in the way they had. The verdict was ready to be read, and with it, the culmination of months of investigation, weeks of testimony, and days of jury deliberation. The next moment would decide whether Lisa would spend the rest of her life behind bars, or whether the jury had found room for mercy. The courtroom stood at the precipice of closure, waiting for the words that would etch themselves into the memory of all who had followed the case. The jury foreperson rose slowly, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on their shoulders. In the hushed courtroom, the verdict was read, each word deliberate, echoing into the silence that had descended upon everyone present. Lisa was found guilty of second-degree murder, a charge that acknowledged the killing as intentional but stopped short of declaring it premeditated. The jury had not fully accepted the prosecution's portrayal of Lisa as a calculating planner, but neither had they believed the defense's argument of panic alone. For them, the truth lay somewhere in between, an act of desperation with deliberate choices made in its aftermath. The words struck the courtroom like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the audience, and the weight of the decision landed heavily on both families. Daniel's relatives clasped one another, tears streaming as relief mingled with grief. For them, the verdict was a confirmation that justice had, in some form, been served. Their son, brother, and friend had not been forgotten, his death not dismissed. Yet even in their relief, the finality of the loss lingered. No conviction could bring Daniel back. No sentence could erase the violent end of his young life. On the other side of the aisle, Lisa's family sat in stunned silence. Her husband's face was pale, his eyes fixed on the woman he had once trusted completely. Her children, shielded from much of the media storm but old enough to understand the gravity of the situation, were left to reconcile the image of their mother with the reality of her conviction. The woman they had known, the caretaker, the constant presence in their lives, was now branded a murderer. The impact on them would be lifelong. A legacy of shame and loss that no verdict could soften. Lisa herself showed little outward reaction. Her expression remained neutral, her body still, though those who looked closely saw the faint tightening of her lips and the rigidness in her posture. For months she had maintained composure, projecting calm in the face of accusation. Now, with her fate sealed, the mask remained, but the cracks were visible. The guilty verdict had reduced the possibilities of her life to a narrow path defined by the justice system. The judge moved quickly to the next phase, setting a date for sentencing. The law required a separate hearing to determine the length of Lisa's imprisonment, one that would weigh aggravating and mitigating factors before delivering the final punishment. The prosecution announced their intent to seek the maximum penalty allowable for second-degree murder, citing the brutality of the act, the concealment of evidence, and the betrayal of trust inherent in Lisa's relationship with Daniel. The defense, conversely, prepared to argue for leniency, emphasizing her lack of prior criminal history, her role as a mother, and the psychological toll of the circumstances leading to the crime. In the weeks before sentencing, the case continued to dominate public discourse. News outlets replayed footage of the verdict, dissecting the implications of second-degree murder versus premeditated first-degree. Some commentators argued the jury had been too lenient, that Lisa's actions after the killing demonstrated clear calculation deserving of the harsher charge. Others suggested the decision struck a balance, recognizing both the intentional nature of the act and the emotional turmoil that had preceded it. Public opinion remained sharply divided. For some, Lisa was a symbol of betrayal, a woman who had shattered the sanctity of family and community for selfish indulgence, and then resorted to violence to protect herself. For others, she was a cautionary tale of what desperation, secrecy, and fear could drive an otherwise ordinary person to do. Both narratives coexisted uneasily in the public imagination, fueling debates about morality, justice, and the thin line between human weakness and monstrous choices. Meanwhile, the families lived in the shadow of the verdict. Daniel's parents prepared statements for the sentencing hearing, determined to remind the court of the life that had been lost. They gathered photographs, memories, and stories, all aimed at painting a picture of Daniel as more than just a victim in a legal proceeding. He had been a son with dreams, a young man whose life had stretched before him with possibility, cut short by Lisa's actions. Their grief was raw, their anger simmering, and they hoped their words would carry weight when the final sentence was decided. Lisa's family also prepared for the sentencing, though their approach was very different. Letters of support were gathered from friends and relatives who spoke of her kindness, her role as a mother, and her contributions to the community before the tragedy. They hoped to present her not only as the convicted woman before the court but as the complex person she had been, someone capable of love and care, someone who had stumbled catastrophically but was not beyond redemption. Her husband's position remained complicated. Torn between betrayal and lingering affection, he wrestled with whether to stand by her or distance himself completely. His decision would not only affect her fate, but also the lives of their children, who looked to him for stability in a world that had collapsed around them. The sentencing hearing itself became another focal point for public interest. Once again, the courtroom filled with observers, journalists, and those who had followed the case from the beginning. The judge listened as victim impact statements were read, the raw pain of Daniel's family laid bare for all to hear. Their words were heavy with sorrow, anger, and a demand for accountability. They spoke of the milestones Daniel would never reach, the empty chair at family gatherings, the cruel finality of his absence. Then came the voices of Lisa's supporters, who pleaded for mercy. They acknowledged the crime but emphasized her humanity, her role as a mother whose children would suffer immensely if she were given the harshest possible sentence. They argued that while punishment was necessary, compassion should not be lost in the pursuit of justice. The judge weighed these statements against the facts of the case, the jury's verdict, and the guidelines of the law. The courtroom waited in tense silence as the sentence was pronounced. Lisa was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20. The decision reflected the gravity of her crime, while leaving a narrow window for eventual release. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Daniel's family wept openly, some relieved that she would face decades behind bars, others frustrated that parole remained a possibility. Lisa's family clung to one another, devastated but faintly relieved that she had not been condemned to life without any hope of freedom. Lisa herself nodded faintly, the faintest flicker of emotion crossing her face as the reality of her future settled in. The conclusion of the trial and sentencing did not erase the deeper scars left behind. The community remained fractured, trust shattered, and the memory of the crime etched into its identity. Neighbors who had once exchanged pleasantries now carried the weight of suspicion and unease, their suburban peace forever broken. For Daniel there was no future, only the legacy of a life cut short and the grief of those who loved him. For Lisa, the future was one of confinement, reflection, and the slow passage of years behind prison walls. For their families, the pain would stretch on, reshaping their lives in ways no verdict or sentence could repair. The trial had ended, but the story continued, carried forward in whispers, in headlines, and in the memories of those who had witnessed how an affair between a housewife and her neighbor's son had spiraled into betrayal, violence, and murder. And with the sentencing complete, the chapter of courtroom drama closed, leaving behind the long, quiet reckoning of lives forever changed. The trial had moved into its most anticipated stage, the defense's presentation. For weeks, the prosecution had paraded an endless stream of witnesses, evidence, and forensic reconstructions, each designed to paint Linda as a calculating, manipulative woman who had groomed a vulnerable young man into becoming both her lover and, eventually, her accomplice. Now the court turned its eyes to the defense table, waiting to see what possible narrative they could present in order to counter such overwhelming weight. The defense attorney rose with deliberate calmness, smoothing the edges of his notes, and began laying the foundation for a new perspective. He argued that what the jury had seen so far was only half the story, a tapestry woven from partial truths and selective framing. According to him, the case was not about a cold-blooded woman orchestrating a murder, but about a tragic entanglement of human weakness, exploitation, and psychological instability. He framed Linda not as a mastermind but as a lonely woman trapped in a suffocating marriage, who had sought comfort in the wrong place. The defense emphasized that mistakes, however grave, did not automatically translate to murder. To bolster this argument, the defense brought in witnesses who had previously remained silent. Neighbors testified to the turbulence inside Linda's marriage with her husband. They described hearing shouting matches that sometimes extended late into the night, the sound of dishes shattering against walls, and even moments when the husband stormed out of the house, slamming the door with enough force to shake the frame. The defense carefully curated these accounts to plant seeds of doubt. Perhaps Linda had not been motivated by greed or lust, but by desperation, by a desire to escape what they implied was an abusive relationship. The strategy, however, was not without risk. By humanizing Linda in this way, the defense also risked reinforcing the prosecution's core argument that Linda was unhappy and had sought drastic means of liberation. The distinction the defense reminded the jury was crucial. An unhappy marriage might explain infidelity, poor judgment, or even emotional breakdowns, but it did not automatically prove premeditation of murder. Then came the moment the court had anticipated with a mixture of fascination and dread. The defense called Linda herself to the stand. The decision was bold, perhaps reckless, but it was clear that her attorney believed her story, delivered in her own words, might sway the jury in ways cross-examined testimony never could. Linda's entrance onto the stand carried an air of theatrical inevitability. Dressed modestly, her makeup subdued, she presented herself not as a seductress but as a weary, vulnerable woman worn thin by years of conflict. She spoke softly at first, recounting the story of her marriage from its early days, when love had quickly soured into resentment. She described her husband as controlling, dismissive, and at times cruelly indifferent to her needs. Her words painted a picture of isolation and emotional starvation, a slow erosion of self-worth that left her susceptible to the attention of someone younger, someone who made her feel seen again. When she recounted the beginnings of her relationship with Daniel, the neighbor's son, she avoided sensational details. Instead, she described the loneliness that had consumed her, the aching silence of nights when her husband slept in another room or returned home drunk and volatile. She confessed that what began as harmless conversations blossomed into something more, but she insisted it had never been about seduction or manipulation. According to her, Daniel had pursued her with youthful intensity, and she, desperate for validation, had failed to resist. The courtroom was riveted. Jurors leaned forward, reporters scribbled furiously, and spectators strained to catch every word. It was a performance balanced between confession and justification, and for a moment she seemed to regain control of the narrative. But then came the inevitable pivot, the prosecution's cross-examination. The prosecutor approached with a demeanor sharpened by weeks of preparation. Each question was precise, each word designed to unravel the fragile tapestry Linda had woven. Did she deny that text messages revealed explicit plotting between her and Daniel? Did she deny that financial records showed her scouring over her husband's insurance policy in the weeks leading up to his death? Did she deny that Daniel, in his own testimony, had said she urged him to act? The more Linda tried to explain, the more tangled her answers became. What she called fantasies shared in private messages, the prosecution reframed as evidence of intent. What she called discussions taken out of context, the prosecution positioned as blueprints for murder. Her insistence that she never asked Daniel to kill anyone rang hollow against the backdrop of screenshots projected on courtroom monitors, where phrases too explicit to reinterpret hung like damning shadows over her defense. Observers noted the subtle shifts in the jury's faces. Where some had softened during her testimony, nodding sympathetically, others now tightened their expressions, recoiling at the contradictions. The prosecution's strategy was simple. Allow Linda enough room to speak herself into corners, then close in with precision strikes that left her credibility battered. The most devastating blow came when the prosecutor read aloud excerpts from Linda's own journal, seized during the investigation. The entries, filled with bitterness and resentment toward her husband, spoke of fantasies of freedom, of starting over, of how life could finally begin, if only the obstacle were removed. While Linda argued these were merely emotional outpourings, the prosecution suggested they were a psychological blueprint, a private rehearsal for what she ultimately set in motion. By the time she stepped down from the witness stand, the momentum of the trial had shifted once again. The defense's gamble had both humanized and incriminated her. She appeared vulnerable, yes, but also calculating, capable of hiding darkness beneath a veil of fragility. As the defense wrapped up their presentation, they attempted to redirect the focus onto Daniel. Their final argument emphasized his youth, his susceptibility, and his potential for exaggeration under pressure. Perhaps, they suggested, Daniel had acted alone, driven by obsession, and was now shifting blame onto Linda to lessen his own sentence. They warned the jury not to conflate moral failure with criminal guilt. Adultery, they reminded them, was not a crime, nor was unhappiness in marriage. But the prosecution's earlier arguments lingered. The defense had sown doubt, yes, but whether it was enough to outweigh weeks of damning evidence was unclear. When the defense rested, the courtroom exhaled collectively. The trial was now approaching its climax, with closing arguments looming on the horizon. Spectators and journalists alike buzzed with speculation. Would the jury view Linda as a manipulative predator who orchestrated a young man's violence, or as a broken woman ensnared in circumstances beyond her control? The next phase promised to deliver answers, or at least the final performance upon which her fate would hinge. And as the gavel struck to adjourn for the day, all eyes turned forward to the final act of a case that had gripped an entire community. The air inside the courtroom on the morning of closing arguments was electric, charged with the weight of weeks of testimony, evidence, and speculation. Every seat was filled, the gallery packed with locals who had followed every twist of the story, journalists eager for soundbites, and family members whose lives had been torn apart by the murder at the center of it all. The trial had transformed from a legal proceeding into a spectacle, and everyone knew that what came next would seal the narrative in the minds of the jury. The prosecution rose first, moving with the confidence of someone who knew their case had been meticulously laid brick by brick. They reminded the jury of the timeline that had been established, the affair, the planning, the mounting resentment, and the eventual act of violence. The prosecutor painted the picture with deliberate precision, tying together the digital trail of text messages, the insurance documents, the testimony of neighbors, and Daniel's account of manipulation. Each piece of evidence was presented as a thread, and together they formed a tapestry too coherent to dismiss. The prosecution emphasized that while Linda had spoken of loneliness, dissatisfaction, and emotional pain, none of those explanations erased the cold reality of intent. The jury was told to focus not on her emotional appeals but on her actions. Actions that led directly to the death of her husband. The strategy was clear. By boiling the story down to actions and evidence rather than emotions, the prosecution sought to strip away any sympathy the defense had tried to cultivate. They described Linda not as a victim but as a predator, someone who had exploited Daniel's immaturity to achieve her goals. It was, in their words, a story of manipulation, selfishness, and ultimately murder disguised as a tragic love affair. The prosecution concluded with a stark statement that echoed through the courtroom, that justice demanded the jury see Linda for what she was, not what she pretended to be. It was not enough, they argued, to feel sorry for her. They had to uphold the law and honor the life that had been taken. When the defense rose, the atmosphere shifted. Their tone was softer, almost pleading, designed not to dismantle the prosecution's evidence but to appeal to the jury's humanity. The defense reminded the jury that their duty was not to punish moral failings, but to weigh criminal responsibility. They stressed that adultery, betrayal, and poor decisions did not equal premeditated murder. The defense returned to the theme of Linda's suffering. They described her marriage as a cage, her life as one filled with control and neglect, and her affair as the desperate act of someone trying to feel alive again. They acknowledged her mistakes but framed them as human, relatable, and tragic rather than criminally intentional. To address the prosecution's reliance on text messages and journals, the defense argued that people often say things in private moments of anger or fantasy that they would never act upon. They described the messages as emotional venting, not instructions. As for Daniel's testimony, they reminded the jury that he stood to gain by shifting blame, that his youth and vulnerability made him an unreliable narrator of events. The defense urged the jury to consider whether they could truly say, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Linda had not only wanted her husband dead, but had actively orchestrated his murder. They pressed the jurors to hold fast to the principle that doubt must favor the accused. Their closing was less about dismantling evidence and more about planting hesitation, a single seed of uncertainty that might grow into a verdict less severe than the prosecution demanded. When the defense concluded, Silence lingered for a moment before the judge gave final instructions to the jury. The jurors were reminded of their solemn duty to deliberate only on the evidence presented, to leave aside sympathy, bias, or personal opinion, and to reach a verdict based solely on the facts and the law. As the jury filed out to begin their deliberations, the courtroom buzzed with whispered speculation. Outside, cameras waited to capture reactions, while inside, both families sat in tense silence. For Linda, the wait was agonizing. Every second felt stretched, every tick of the clock a reminder that her future rested in the hands of 12 strangers. The deliberations stretched into hours, then into the night. Journalists gathered outside the courthouse, filing updates about the length of the discussion, noting how the jury had requested to review specific evidence, particularly the text messages and journal entries. The longer they deliberated, the more speculation grew. Some suggested it meant the jury was struggling to reach consensus, others that they were carefully working through every detail to ensure no mistake would be made. Inside the jury room, the debate was intense. Some jurors believed the evidence of premeditation was overwhelming, pointing to the consistency of the text messages and Daniel's testimony. Others hesitated, uneasy about relying so heavily on the words of a young man who had admitted his own role in the crime. The discussion swung back and forth, with each side presenting reasons for conviction or doubt. By the second day, tension was mounting. Linda's defense team whispered among themselves about possible outcomes, preparing for both acquittal and conviction. The prosecution, though outwardly confident, remained vigilant, knowing that trials were unpredictable until the very end. On the afternoon of the third day, word spread that the jury had reached a decision. The atmosphere inside the courthouse grew taut, every person aware that the next few minutes would define the story forever. Reporters scrambled to position themselves, family members clasped their hands tightly, and Linda herself sat frozen, her face unreadable but her eyes betraying fear. The jury filed back into the courtroom, each member carrying the weight of their verdict. The foreperson stood, holding the slip of paper that contained the decision, and the silence was absolute as it was handed to the judge. The document was unfolded, the words scanned, and then the verdict was prepared to be read aloud. The entire room held its breath, poised on the edge of revelation, waiting for the final pronouncement that would either condemn or release. And in that suspended moment, the story of betrayal, passion, and death was about to find its conclusion in the solemn words of the court. The silence inside the courtroom stretched into something heavy, suffocating, as the verdict was read aloud. The words carried a finality that cut through weeks of speculation and testimony, ending all uncertainty in a single declaration: guilty of first-degree murder. The weight of that verdict settled over the room like a dark cloud, and for a moment, no one moved. It was the culmination of everything: the affair, the deceit, the forensic evidence, the testimonies, all distilled into one undeniable truth. Linda's face drained of color. Her carefully constructed composure, maintained through every stage of the trial, faltered in that instant. The verdict was not just a statement of law but a judgment of her very existence, a stripping away of all attempts to cast herself as victim or misunderstood. For the jury, her vulnerability had not outweighed the cold pattern of evidence. The texts, the journals, the manipulations, they had all spoken louder than her words. Around the room, reactions broke the silence in fragmented waves. The victim's family clutched one another tightly, some weeping, others sitting in stunned relief. It was a release of years of pent-up grief, the acknowledgement that their loved one's life had mattered, that the system had recognized the crime for what it was. Across the aisle, Linda's family reacted with disbelief. Tears fell freely as they whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in denial, others collapsing under the enormity of what had just been announced. The jurors, their task complete, sat solemnly, their expressions etched with fatigue. They had carried the burden of judgment, and now, having delivered their decision, they seemed both relieved and haunted. A guilty verdict in a case like this was never easy, no matter how convincing the evidence. The realization that their words had condemned someone to decades behind bars weighed heavily on each of them. The judge thanked the jury for their service, acknowledging the difficulty of their duty. Then came the matter of sentencing, a process that would determine how long Linda would spend in prison for her crime. The prosecution, emboldened by the verdict, pushed for the maximum penalty available, arguing that the crime had been coldly calculated and executed without regard for the sanctity of life. They emphasized the betrayal, the manipulation, and the selfishness that had driven Linda to orchestrate her husband's death. For them, leniency was not an option. The defense, however, made a final plea. They asked the court to consider Linda's life in totality, not just the darkest chapter of it. They pointed to her previously clean record, her role as a mother, and the complexities of her unhappy marriage. They framed her as someone who had lost her way, not an irredeemable monster. Their hope was not for acquittal, it was too late for that, but for mercy, for a sentence that left room for rehabilitation rather than complete erasure of her future. The sentencing hearing was as emotional as the trial itself. Victim impact statements were read aloud, each one a raw testament to the devastation left in the wake of the crime. Family members spoke of the emptiness at birthdays, the silence during holidays, the absence that could never be filled. They described the victim not as a statistic but as a person of flesh and blood, someone whose laughter, guidance, and presence had been stolen from them. Their words echoed with anger, sorrow, and longing, underscoring the depth of the wound that Linda's actions had inflicted. When it was Linda's turn to address the court, she rose slowly, her voice subdued. She did not contest the verdict, but neither did she admit to the premeditation the jury had found. She spoke of regret, of sorrow for the pain caused, but her words were met with divided reactions. Some in the gallery dismissed them as hollow, another attempt to manipulate sympathy, while others saw flashes of sincerity in her trembling tone. Regardless, her statement carried little weight compared to the evidence already judged. The judge's decision, when it came, was delivered with a gravity that matched the crime. Linda was sentenced to life in prison. The possibility of parole set so far in the future it offered little comfort. It was a sentence designed not only to punish, but to send a message about the sanctity of human life, and the consequences of calculated betrayal. As the gavel fell, the courtroom exhaled as one. The trial, the weeks of tension, the endless speculation, it was over. Linda was led away in handcuffs, her fate sealed by the justice system she had tried to bend to her will. The sight of her being escorted out, her shoulders slumped, her future erased, was a stark reminder of how far she had fallen from the quiet suburban life she once led. Outside the courthouse, the story rippled outward. News outlets delivered the verdict across television screens and digital feeds, turning the case into a symbol of betrayal and consequence. Commentators dissected the trial, debating the dynamics of power, gender, and manipulation that had defined the affair. Some focused on the tragedy of a family destroyed, while others fixated on the sensational elements of the scandal. The forbidden romance, the age gap, the murder. For the community, the verdict marked both an end and a beginning. The shadows of the crime would linger in conversations, in neighborhood whispers, in the way people glanced at the house where it all began. The victim's family would carry their grief forward, tempered slightly by the knowledge that justice, however imperfect, had been served. Linda's family would grapple with the stigma, with the reality that their loved one was now forever defined by her darkest act. Daniel's role in the crime remained a subject of fascination and debate. His testimony had been instrumental in convicting Linda, but questions lingered about his own accountability. Some saw him as a victim of her manipulation, others as an active participant who had escaped harsher consequences by cooperating. His future would remain marked by the stain of his involvement, no matter the legal outcome. The broader public consumed the case with an insatiable appetite. True crime enthusiasts dissected every detail, from the early signs of the affair to the forensic reconstruction of the murder. Documentaries and podcasts began production before the ink on the sentencing documents was dry, eager to transform tragedy into narrative. The story would live on, retold in countless forms, each iteration preserving its place in the cultural imagination. For Linda, however, the story had reached its conclusion. Prison walls would become her world, the outside life a distant memory. Her affair, once a secret source of thrill and validation, had collapsed into the harsh reality of consequence. What began as an escape from loneliness had ended in total isolation, her freedom traded for years of reflection in the confines of a cell. The trial's end marked the final chapter of a story that had begun in quiet suburban normalcy, and spiraled into betrayal, violence, and death. It was a reminder of how ordinary lives could unravel into extraordinary darkness, how hidden desires and secret choices could erupt into devastation. And as the courthouse emptied, the echoes of the verdict lingered, a haunting reminder that in the end, truth had been laid bare, and justice, however harsh, had claimed its due. In the months following the sentencing, the aftermath of the case continued to ripple through every life it had touched. Linda's imprisonment marked the official end of her freedom, but it did not erase the consequences that lingered outside the prison walls. Her family, once her shield and support, faced the daunting task of navigating a world irrevocably altered. Her children, no longer able to see their mother daily, struggled to reconcile the loving parent they remembered with the convicted murderer their lives had been reduced to. Their adolescence, already fraught with challenges, was now marked by stigma, whispered rumors at school, and the ever-present shadow of public scrutiny. Linda herself had begun to adapt to her new existence, though adaptation did not equal acceptance. In the quiet of her cell, she was forced to confront the full weight of her actions, replaying decisions, conversations, and moments of temptation that had led her to this point. She reflected on the initial loneliness that had sparked the affair, the dangerous allure of Daniel's youthful attention, and the escalating tension that had culminated in murder. Every memory, once private and unremarkable, now bore the indelible stain of tragedy. Letters from family were infrequent and filtered through the lens of legal regulation, but each one became a lifeline, a reminder that part of her old life still existed outside the walls. Yet these correspondences also carried reminders of what had been lost: childhood milestones she could not attend, birthdays celebrated in her absence, and moments of intimacy and normalcy she could no longer experience. The realization of these losses became as much a punishment as the years in her sentence. Meanwhile, Daniel's life continued under public scrutiny. Though he had cooperated with the prosecution and escaped a prison sentence himself, the label of accomplice clung to him in the court of public opinion. Friends and neighbors who once sympathized with him now regarded him warily, unsure of how much responsibility he bore. He wrestled with guilt, relief, and shame, recognizing that his own choices had irrevocably changed lives, including his own. The narrative of the affair, manipulation, and murder would follow him forever, a constant reminder that youthful infatuation can carry devastating consequences when mixed with secrecy and moral compromise. The community around them continued to process the shock of the crime. Homes that had once felt safe were now perceived with suspicion, conversations were tinged with caution, and trust had been fractured in ways that could not be fully repaired. Neighbors who had once waved cheerfully now avoided prolonged interaction, and the house where the tragedy unfolded became a focal point of whispered speculation. The story, though concluded in the courtroom, lived on in every interaction, every glance, and every retelling of the events. True crime enthusiasts and media outlets seized upon the details, turning the case into documentaries, podcasts, and articles. Each retelling focused on the elements most sensational: the forbidden affair, the manipulation of a young man, the calculated steps to cover up a murder, and the eventual unraveling of lies in court. Analysts debated motive, morality, and psychology, dissecting every decision Linda had made, every text message sent, and every choice Daniel had taken. In the wider world, the story became a cautionary tale of human desire, secrecy, and consequence, a reminder of how quickly ordinary lives can spiral into disaster. Psychologists and criminologists weighed in on the case, attempting to understand how the combination of marital dissatisfaction, emotional vulnerability, and illicit attraction could lead to such an extreme outcome. Their analyses suggested a complex interplay of impulse control, moral reasoning, and social pressure. Linda, they concluded, had not been purely evil nor purely a victim of circumstance. She was, instead, emblematic of a gray zone in human behavior where desire, secrecy, and fear collide with fatal consequences. For Linda's family, life became a long-term struggle with both grief and guilt. Her husband, though relieved that justice had been served, still wrestled with conflicting emotions: rage, betrayal, sorrow, and remnants of love that could not simply vanish. He worked to maintain a semblance of stability for the children, attempting to shield them from the full magnitude of the crime, while helping them process the psychological fallout. Therapy, community support, and vigilance became daily necessities, a constant reminder that trauma does not end with a verdict. Daniel, too, sought a way forward, attending counseling to process his role in the events and the loss of his innocence. He confronted not only the death of Linda's husband, but the moral compromises he had made along the way. Each day was a struggle to reconcile his past decisions with the desire to live a future unburdened by constant self-recrimination. Even as he attempted to rebuild, he knew the shadow of the affair and the murder would linger indefinitely. In the broader scope, the case left an indelible mark on legal precedent and public awareness. Discussions of manipulation, coercion, and the psychological dynamics of forbidden relationships intensified. Lawyers, educators, and parents debated the signs of unhealthy attachments, the responsibilities of adults in relationships with younger individuals, and the potential for seemingly innocuous actions to escalate into irreversible consequences. The story served not only as a criminal case but as a cultural touchstone, a real-world lesson in morality, accountability, and the fragility of human ethics. Linda's imprisonment, while punitive, also became a crucible for reflection. Letters from fellow inmates, readings of legal texts, and solitary contemplation forced her to confront both her past actions and their implications. She came to understand the enormity of the ripple effects she had created, the devastation of a family, the societal shockwaves, and the moral consequences she could never undo. In these quiet moments, removed from the chaos of trial and media attention, she faced the stark reality of choice and consequence in a way that no courtroom could fully impose. Over time, the story became part of the fabric of the community's collective memory. Schools, local forums, and neighborhood discussions referenced it as a lesson in ethics, trust, and human frailty. The house where it all began eventually changed hands, yet the history of its walls remained, a silent witness to betrayal and tragedy. For those who lived nearby, the events were a permanent reminder that darkness can emerge from the most ordinary settings, that danger can lurk behind familiar faces, and that decisions driven by desire or desperation can leave irreversible scars. In the end, the affair that had begun as a secret, thrilling connection between a housewife and her neighbor's son ended, not in secrecy or quiet regret, but in murder, public exposure, and life-altering consequences for all involved. It became a story of human complexity, of moral failure, and of the fragile line separating passion from destruction. The lessons were stark and enduring. The intersection of secrecy, manipulation, and impulsive desire can spiral into tragedy, leaving no participant untouched, no life untouched, and no memory untainted. As the years passed, those affected carried the weight of the events in their own ways. Linda's children grew up with the legacy of the crime shaping their identities. Daniel matured under the shadow of guilt and infamy. Families and neighbors continued to navigate the fractures left by the betrayal and violence. The story, though legally concluded, persisted in memory, narrative, and cultural discourse, a chilling reminder of how quickly ordinary lives can become extraordinary in their darkness. And so the tale of the housewife's affair with her neighbor's son, a secret that began in loneliness and desire, ended in murder, conviction, and lifelong consequences, leaving behind a community, a family, and a nation forever changed. The legacy of the crime remained a warning, an unspoken moral etched into the collective consciousness. Human choices, no matter how private, can echo outward with devastating consequences, and the consequences of betrayal are often far more permanent than anyone anticipates. And at the end, if you found this story as shocking and gripping as we did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more true crime stories that dive deep into the darkest and most twisted cases from around the world. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell, so you never miss an update. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of this case shocked you the most? And if you want us to cover more true crime stories like this, let us know which cases we should investigate next. Remember, the truth is always stranger than fiction, and every story leaves a lesson behind. Stay tuned, stay curious, and stay safe.